Chapter 141. You still like him, don't you? He said in a deep voice. Pei Chichi couldn't take it anymore. She turned her face away. I don't. Tang Yu was still staring at her little face. Even though he couldn't see it clearly, it was as if he wanted to pin her figure firmly in his eyes. If you don't. He narrowed his eyes and suddenly reached out to grab her hair. His handsome face approached dangerously and his voice was cold without a trace of warmth. Then prove it to me. Pei Chichi's scalp hurt. She was also shocked. She didn't know how he wanted her to prove it. But he just grabbed her and pressed her little face down. Humiliation, shame, and resentment. She was forced to endure the urge to vomit. She didn't know how long he tortured her. In a daze, she heard him say coldly, Pei Chichi, do you know that this is the way to treat a bought woman? He was happy, but he still didn't let her go. That night, Tang Yu was a demon. If Tang Yu was a bit rough the last time Lin Jinrong appeared in Xia City, then this night could be said to be brutal. At dawn, she lay like a rag doll. There was no spirit in her eyes. Tang Yu had already showered and put on his clothes. One night was enough to sober him up. He stood by the bed and looked at Pei Chichi. He said calmly, last night, I enjoyed myself to the fullest. She didn't respond. She still lay there with the thin quilt covering her body. Under the morning light, her exposed shoulders and arms were covered with bruises. Tang Yu's gaze was dull, but he still said calmly, Pei Chichi, when I'm done playing, I'll let you go. By then, you can be with whoever you want. She moved slowly and stared at him blankly. Then she curled up her body and hugged her shoulders with her hands. Pei Chichi was very cold, her head was dizzy and her body was in extreme pain. But she wouldn't beg him. He said that she was a woman bought by him. She only deserved to be treated like this. She was in great pain, but she was at ease. He didn't like her, which was good. She didn't want to be saddled with emotional debt. Because, that was very tiring. Pei Chichi slowly closed her eyes, tears flowing from the corners of her eyes. She was only 20 years old, but there were so many things in her life that were beyond her control. This time, she was really tired. Auntie Li answered Tang Yu's call and arrived at Xia City. She opened the door and was stunned. How could he bear to be so ruthless? Auntie Li kept saying, and her heart was trembling. She carefully helped Pei Chichi to take a bath and cleaned her up. Everywhere, it was everywhere. Auntie Li knew how Pei Chichi was treated. When a man becomes ruthless, he really isn't human. Pei Chichi didn't say anything. She just kept washing herself with water. Auntie Li was experienced. She carefully found some ointment for Pei Chichi to apply. After everything was done, she still said, Auntie, I have to say something that I shouldn't say. It's better to be more submissive. Don't make yourself suffer. Pei Chichi lay there, her long hair spread on the snow-white pillow. Auntie Li had already changed the bedsheets. She lay on this bed that was filled with Tang Yu's scent. When she closed her eyes, she saw his beast-like eyes in the dark last night and his violent methods. She also remembered that when he treated her like that, she was with him countless times. Chapter 142. I'll go make some porridge for you to eat. Auntie Li didn't know what to say. How could Mr. Tang bear to follow Mr. Tang at such a young age? He used to dote on her like a good baby, but now he's turning against me. Auntie Li thought as she worked. When she brought the porridge to her room, Pei Chichi was already asleep. Even in her sleep, she was still hugging her own body, feeling extremely insecure. Auntie Li looked at her silently for a while, then brought the porridge out. She must be exhausted. Auntie Li felt sorry for her, but there was nothing she could do. After all, she was a servant and an outsider, so she shouldn't say anything about Mr. Tang's affairs. Pei Chichi slept for a long time, all the way until dusk fell. Late at night, she gently sat up. It was still painful, but the pain was cool. She looked down and saw that some bruises had been applied with green ointment. She was hungry, but she would rather sit in the dark. After a long time, she suddenly looked around in shock. Tang Yu wasn't here. Thinking of him, her body trembled uncontrollably. She reached out to turn on the light, and the bedroom was lit up. On the wall opposite the luxurious ivory bed, there was a huge round mirror, and she saw herself in a daze in the mirror. Who she liked and who she didn't like was never up to her. Pei Chichi gently raised her hand and gently touched her lips. She remembered how she panted slightly, her eyes half closed. Her body was like a tree branch in a storm, shaking and swaying. She didn't eat for a whole day, and her head was a little dizzy, so she supported herself outside. Auntie Lee had left long ago, but she still thoughtfully prepared food for her, which she could eat after heating up. After Pei Chichi heated up the food, she sat at the table in a daze for a while, then lowered her head to eat. But as she ate, she began to cry. Pei Chichi, don't cry. When you decided to sell yourself to Tang Yu, you should have known that this day would come. To have been treated like this. She bit her lip so hard that it almost broke. Last night was a nightmare that would haunt her for a lifetime. She curled up on the sofa and called Pei Ming's ward. The nurse thoughtfully placed the phone next to Pei Ming's ear. Dad, I'm a little busy today. I can't come. Pei Chichi's voice was soft. Pei Ming could only let out a long hum to show that he understood. When Pei Chichi heard that voice, the tears that had stopped flowed out again. She reached out to wipe the cold tears and squeezed out a smile, as if Pei Ming could see it. Dad, you have to be good. I'll come see you in 2 days. She coaxed him as if he was a child. Only by talking to him could Pei Chichi find some warmth and temporarily forget last night's humiliation. As Pei Ming listened, tears streamed down his bandaged face. He knew it in his heart, but he couldn't say it. He let out another long whimper. Pei Chichi covered her mouth for fear that she would cry. Her eyes were a little dry and painful because she had shed too many tears. She closed her eyes. After a while, she quickly said, Dad, that's it. Sleep early. She hung up the phone and slowly curled up. She hugged her knees and buried her face deep into them. The lights slowly dimmed. She was alone in the pitch-black living room. Chapter 143. Early the next morning, someone knocked on the door. Pei Chichi looked up. There was some fear in her lifeless eyes as she stared at the door. The door kept ringing, again and again, tirelessly. Finally, Pei Chichi walked over barefoot and opened the door. It was a courier outside. There's a package for Mr. Tang here. The young man outside took out the package. Is Mr. Tang here? Pei Chichi hesitated a little, but she still took it. He's not here. I'll collect it for him. The courier agreed. As he signed for it, he asked casually, Excuse me, are you Mr. Tang's? Pei Chichi looked up and looked at the young man. The latter suddenly felt that he was a little rude, but he couldn't take back his words. Pei Chichi retracted her gaze and looked at the place where she signed. She said softly, I'm a part-time worker here. The young man replied with an "oh" and left with a smile. Pei Chichi held the package. Her fingers were cold. She looked at it carefully. It was an urgent letter with the word document written on it. She looked at it and hesitated for a moment. Then, she picked up her phone and called Tang Yu. After a few long rings, he picked up the phone. His voice was very indifferent. What's the matter? After what happened, Pei Chichi didn't dare to provoke him unless it was necessary. She lowered her eyes and said softly, There's a document, sent here. She didn't use home but here. Tang Yu caught it easily. Open the document and take a picture of it for me, he said calmly and then hung up. Pei Chichi pursed her lips. She opened the document and took a picture of it carefully. She wanted to send it to him, but she realized that she didn't have his social media account. She was stunned, but she still called him. This time, it wasn't him who picked up. It was a familiar yet unfamiliar female voice. Are you looking for the president? Pei Chichi was stunned. Xiao Ran smiled faintly. I am Secretary Xiao. The CEO is in New York and is currently in a meeting. Pei Chichi nodded. I want to send him the photo. Add this WeChat number. Xiao Ran gave him a string of numbers. I'll hang up first. I'll send it now. I'll be waiting. Waiting to use it. Pei Chichi understood. If they were to wait to use it, then Tang Yu's original schedule would be delayed by at least 2 days. But he left early. Pei Chichi was stunned for a moment. She followed Xiao Ran's instructions and added the WeChat number. She actually wanted to delete the photo when she sent it over, but she didn't dare to. On the other side, Xiao Ran received the photo and opened it. He connected his phone to his computer and downloaded it before returning the phone to Tang Yu. President, it's done. Tang Yu nodded and continued with the New York branch meeting. It was evening in New York. After the meeting ended, he called out to Xiao Ran. Don't wait for me. Go back to the hotel first. Xiao Ran was stunned. Her intuition told her that there must be something wrong with the CEO and his little sweetheart. Otherwise, they wouldn't have brought forward their schedule. Although Tang Yu's performance was no different from usual, Xiao Ran was his close subordinate. How could she not see that he was different from before? Tang Yu's current behavior deepened her suspicions. Xiao Ran nodded. Then I'll go back first. Have a good weekend, boss. If she hadn't mentioned it, Tang Yu would have forgotten that it was the weekend. He had originally planned to come over after the weekend, but that night, he lost control. Chapter 144. He treated her like the apple of his eye. She knew it too, but she didn't take it to heart. From the beginning to the end, she only liked Jinrong. Ever since that day in the hospital, he understood. Tang Yu laughed at himself for being silly. He turned around, took out a cigarette from his pocket, and quietly lit it. He had smoked a lot these 2 days, but no matter how many cigarettes he smoked, it didn't stop him from thinking about that night. She was in pain, and so was he. She was in pain, and so was he. She didn't do anything like that, and neither did he. Her little teeth had bitten him too. Even as he thought about it, the bite started to hurt again, all the way to his heart. He didn't even have the right to ask Pei Chichi for an explanation. He was the one who had bought her. He had bought her body, but not her heart. He had asked her to be loyal, and she had done it. She and Jinrong didn't do anything. But Jinrong was in her heart. Tang Yu wasn't a saint. He couldn't accept it. He used to think that she would like him. He exhaled the last puff of smoke, picked up his jacket and walked out. On the other side, Pei Chichi put down her phone, pursing her lips and looking at it for a long time. After that, she brushed her teeth and washed her face, then made herself a bowl of chicken noodles. Tang Yu wasn't around, but she wanted to eat it. When she took the bus to school, she felt a little dizzy, she felt groggy and uncomfortable, but she still managed to go to class for half a day. At noon, Chen Xinjie looked at her face and asked worriedly, Chichi, are you alright? Why don't you go back first? Pei Chichi's voice was a little hoarse when she spoke. Alright, help me apply for leave for the afternoon class. She dragged her bag and slowly walked out. A slender figure stood at the door of the classroom. It was Lin Jinrong. Pei Chichi walked past him and quietly walked towards the shady path. But Lin Jinrong caught up with her in a few steps. He frowned as he looked at her pale face. Did he make things difficult for you? Pei Chichi stood still. She lifted her eyes and looked at Lin Jinrong. Lin Jinrong, have you not forgotten that feeling from the past? He froze. Pei Chichi smiled faintly. This smile made her face look even paler. She lowered her eyelashes. Her curly eyelashes fluttered gently, like 2 small brushes that were as cute and dense as a pair of small brushes. Lin Jinrong, if you are just unwilling, then I can tell you now. Pei Chichi suddenly looked up and quietly looked at him. I did like you, but this kind of love has long been destroyed by reality. There is nothing left. He was still looking into her eyes. Pei Chichi said somewhat self-deprecatingly, Lin Jinrong, I'm different from you. You have enough family background and can do whatever you want. Even when you and Pei Huan are about to get married, you can still tell me that you like her. But do you know, the moment I was sold to Tang Yu and laid under him, my name was no longer Pei Chichi. Called what? Lin Jinrong's voice was a little shaky. Pei Chichi lifted her eyes and looked at the long maple forest in front of her. After a long time, she said softly, merchandise. Lin Jinrong stared at her closely. Pei Chichi, you can also not be, from being Tang Yu's mistress to being your mistress? Pei Chichi smiled and lowered her eyes. Lin Jinrong, don't pester me anymore. This will only make my life worse. Chapter 145. Lin Jinrong just looked at her. He clenched his fists and wanted to chase after her, but He was in no position to do so. Pei Chichi took the bus. She did not go to the hospital because the bruises all over her body would arouse suspicion. Back at the apartment, Auntie Lee prepared lunch for her. Pei Chichi put down her bag and sat at the dining table. "Auntie, how did you know I would be back at noon?" Auntie Lee looked at her and finally felt relieved. She glanced at her. "I thought you didn't go out. Look, you still went to school with all these injuries. You must be feeling unwell now." Before Pei Chichi could say anything, Auntie Lee could not help but scold her. Women should take care of themselves, especially. It was not easy to finish her sentence, but Pei Chichi understood. She just nodded silently. Auntie Lee felt sorry for her and gently stroked her head. "You can't be like this in the future. Be more obedient." Pei Chichi nodded again. After lunch, Auntie Lee reached out to check the temperature. It was fine. She felt relieved and left to let her have a good rest. Dinner was ready and she just needed to heat it up. Pei Chichi went to the bedroom and lay down. Her head was dizzy and she rested her head on the pillow. Tang Yu's smell was everywhere. Her little hand slowly touched the pillow that he usually slept on. Gently, she touched it and unknowingly hugged it in her arms. Just like that, she fell asleep. When she woke up, she was covered in cold sweat. She was woken up by the ringtone of her phone. Pei Chichi looked at the darkness around her and looked at the time. It was already 8 o'clock at night. The ringtone was still relentlessly ringing. She picked it up and saw that it was Pei Huan. She frowned but still picked it up. "What's the matter?" Pei Huan's voice was hurried and sharp. "Pei Chichi, come over and see what your good friend has done." Before Pei Chichi could speak, Pei Huan screamed hysterically. "Chen Xinjie slept with Jinrong." "Pei Chichi, are you satisfied now?" As Pei Huan spoke, her body slid down. She sat on the carpet of the hotel and pressed against the door to prevent the people inside from going out. Outside the door were the people from the Lin family. They were all called over by Pei Huan. In the bedroom, Lin Jinrong leaned against the headboard and smoked calmly. There was not much expression on his face. On the other side of the quilt, Chen Xinjie pulled the quilt to cover her naked body. She didn't back down either. "Pei Huan, this is nothing. Didn't you climb into Lin Jinrong's bed like this? Why can't I?" Pei Huan was in tears, and her hair was as messy as a chicken's nest. She had just fought with Chen Xinjie. Her tears ruined the delicate makeup on her face, making her look a little scary. She just sat there muttering as if she had gone mad. The Lin family members outside did not dare to rush in, afraid that the child in Pei Huan's belly would be gone. They could only wait outside. Pei Huan stared into Chen Xinjie's eyes and said sternly, "At that time, Lin Jinrong did not want to get married." Chen Xinjie sneered. "But he likes Pei Chichi. Pei Huan, you know that." Pei Huan glared at her as if she was going to tear Chen Xinjie apart. "From the beginning to the end, I have underestimated you, my lackey." Pei Huan's eyes were fierce. She might pounce on Chen Xinjie at any time. However, Chen Xinjie was not afraid. It was not her who was pregnant. After a while, Pei Huan calmed down. "But I want to thank you. If you hadn't taken the initiative to give me that invitation, I would not have had the chance to be pregnant with Jinrong's child." Chapter 146. Pei Huan turned to look at Lin Jinrong. Lin Jinrong didn't seem to care and looked indifferent. Pei Huan was in despair. Just then, there was a knock on the door. The voice was familiar to Pei Huan. "Pei Huan, it's me." Pei Huan wiped her tears, then looked at the couple on the bed and sneered. She got up and opened the door. Pei Chichi walked in slowly. The room was filled with the smell of alcohol and love jades. There were also male and female clothing strewn all over the floor. From the outside to the inside, they were strewn everywhere. Her gaze finally fell on Lin Jinrong and Chen Xinjie. When she met Pei Chichi's gaze, Chen Xinjie flinched. Pei Chichi smiled faintly. "Pei Chichi, look, your best friend slept with the man you like. How does it feel?" Pei Huan leaned close to her face and said nervously. Pei Chichi turned her face and stared at Pei Huan. Her face was already a mess from crying. But Pei Huan was still smiling. She smiled without a care in the world. After looking at her for a long time, Pei Chichi suddenly felt pity for Pei Huan. So what if she spent so much effort to get it? She said softly, Pei Huan, the man Chen Xinjie slept with is your husband, not the man I like. Pei Huan was stunned. Then she sneered and raised her chin. Pei Chichi, do you know how much your best friend has done for you? I know. Pei Chichi's gaze fell on Chen Xinjie's face. She likes Lin Jinrong. She was the one who exposed me and Tang Yu. She even took my library card and borrowed Lin Jinrong's book and gave it to Tang Yu on purpose. Chen Xinjie was stunned. Her lips trembled and she stared at Pei Chichi. Why didn't you say anything? There's no need. Pei Chichi's face was pale and indifferent. She looked at Lin Jinrong and Lin Jinrong looked at her. Lin Jinrong, I only have one question for you now. Do you and Pei Huan still have a wedding? She asked quietly without a trace of emotion. Pei Huan had called Pei Chichi over because they had already fallen out with each other. Now, she was actually a little nervous. She had always known that Lin Jinrong did not like her and that he had no choice but to marry her. She didn't actually care that Lin Jinrong had slept with Chen Xinjie. She just wanted to let Pei Chichi know that the man in her heart had slept with someone else. She just wanted to make it impossible for Pei Chichi and Lin Jinrong. However, Pei Huan didn't know that from the moment she climbed into Lin Jinrong's bed, it was impossible for Pei Chichi and Lin Jinrong. Now, Pei Huan was afraid. The matter had become so big. Would Jinrong break up the marriage? Her fingers were gripping Pei Chichi's clothes tightly. Lin Jinrong smiled faintly. He didn't directly answer Pei Chichi's question. Instead, he said calmly, Pei Chichi, we are the same kind of person now. Pei Chichi stood there motionlessly. The blood in her body seemed to have frozen. Only she would understand the meaning behind Lin Jinrong's words. Lin Jinrong's gaze fell on her face for a long time. Then, he lifted the blanket and put on his pants. When he was putting on his shirt, Chen Xinjie grabbed his arm. Jinrong. It's just sex. You won't take it seriously, right? Lin Jinrong patted her face. Okay, let go now. Chen Xinjie was stunned. She thought that Lin Jinrong would more or less care about it. He wasn't that drunk last night, but he was willing to sleep with her. She thought that he had feelings for her. Chapter 147. Pei Huan was in a daze. When she came back to her senses, he had already walked past her. He and Pei Huan had never interacted before. Even after they got married, they had never shared their hearts with each other. But when he passed by Pei Chichi, he paused and walked out. When the door closed, Pei Huan screamed, Jinrong, I know you're doing this for Pei Chichi. Yes, he was doing this to help Pei Chichi and Chen Xinjie shed all pretenses. He had actually sacrificed so much. Lin Jinrong, who was outside, froze, and smiled faintly. Perhaps. Pei Huan was in tears. She turned around slowly and looked at Pei Chichi. Her voice was unbelievably hoarse. Pei Chichi, you win. Pei Chichi's lips tightened. She lowered her head and smiled faintly. Really? She didn't even look at Chen Xinjie as she walked out. All of this had nothing to do with her. It was the last drop of blood connection between her and Pei Huan that made her come. Perhaps it was because she didn't want the child in Pei Huan's belly to be like her. Without a complete family, that feeling of being like duckweed was really not good. When she walked out, the streets were filled with lights, and it was a little dizzying. Pei Chichi's legs wobbled. She lifted her head and looked at the bustling city. Where was her home? She was very tired, extremely tired. A red sports car stopped in front of her. The car window rolled down, and a young, good-looking but grumpy face appeared. How much? Pei Chichi covered her collar and looked up at the man. Under the lights, her eyes were as unreachable as the stars in the sky. They were enshrouded in mist, and yet so touchable. The man was a little stunned. From afar, he only thought that she was a good-looking girl, but up close, there was not a single part of her that wasn't beautiful. It was a kind of beauty that couldn't be described with words. He looked a little more sincere. I can give you everything you want as long as you follow me. Pei Chichi took a step back. She muttered, someone has already bought me. She smiled at the man absent-mindedly and walked forward. She knew that the person who bought her had thought of marrying her. But she didn't dare to know, and she didn't dare to think too deeply about it. Just thinking about it would send her to hell. This was really good, really good. At least, she didn't have to worry about him looking at her as if she was a liar. She would not be abandoned by anyone ever again. She didn't want to be abandoned again. Auntie Lee sat on the edge of the bed and watched Pei Chichi talk in her sleep. She was extremely worried. What should he do? It had already been half the night. He had measured the temperature and found that it was only a low fever. After taking the medicine and sweating, he had recovered. Why was he still having nightmares? Auntie Lee thought that Mr. Tang must have scared her that day. She took care of him for the whole night, but he still didn't wake up at dawn. He refused to wake up. She had no choice but to call Mr. Tang's secretary, Miss Xiao. Miss Xiao. I am Auntie Lee from Xia City. Auntie Lee was very polite. Xiao Ran nodded. What can I do for you? Auntie Lee hesitated for a moment and said in a low voice, it's like this. Miss Pei is sick. I don't know what to do. If it's convenient, please pass a message to Mr. Tang. Xiao Ran grunted. I will. She paused. Please take care of her for the next 2 days. Chapter 148. She put down the phone and walked into Tang Yu's office. Tang Yu was dealing with work. He didn't even look up when he heard the door open. What's the matter? Xiao Ran stood there. There was a call from B City just now. Tang Yu's fingers paused. He looked up at Xiao Ran's eyes and asked, who was it? Xiao Ran was sure that she heard a hint of anticipation in his tone. She smiled in her heart, but her face was as calm as usual. It's Auntie Lee. Tang Yu's eyes dimmed. He nodded and looked down at the documents in his hands. Xiao Ran paused for a moment before continuing. Auntie Lee said that Chichi is sick. It sounds serious. Tang Yu's pen left a long mark on the paper. He was obviously stunned. He looked up but didn't say anything immediately. Xiao Ran was a smart man. He smiled faintly. CEO, there's a flight to B City at 10 o'clock tonight. Tang Yu raised his hand and looked at the time. Book the ticket for me. You stay here and finish the rest of the work. Yes. Xiao Ran watched him walk out with his coat. Tang Yu didn't even go back to the hotel. He drove directly to the airport. In just a short period of 20 hours, he had actually become extremely anxious. He didn't even feel like this when he first took over Shengyuan. He was even more surprised that he had surrendered so easily. He had been rough with Pei Chichi, but it didn't mean that he wasn't angry anymore. He had wanted to give her the cold shoulder and even give up on her. A phone call had easily destroyed all his perseverance. On the plane, he closed his eyes and tried to find all the good things about her in his mind. After searching for a while, he really couldn't tell what was good about her except for her good looks and the chicken shredded noodles she cooked. But even so, he was still too concerned about her. When he saw that scene, he couldn't help but be rough with her. That kind of method, for a 20-year-old girl, was a bit too cruel. Previously, he had always planned to treat her well. The plane landed at B City's airport. Shengyuan headquarters arranged for a car to pick them up. Tang Yu closed his eyes and said, to Xia City. The driver turned the car into the traffic. 10 minutes later, Tang Yu, who was resting with his eyes closed, suddenly frowned. Drive faster. Mr. Tang, this is already the fastest. The driver expressed his innocence. Tang Yu didn't say anything else, but he didn't continue to rest. Instead, he looked at the dark night outside. This kind of night was very similar to the night when he was drunk. In her heart, she must hate him to the core. As he thought about it, his heart ached. Half an hour later, the car stopped. Tang Yu opened the door to the apartment. Auntie Lee was still there, blowing on a bowl of soup. When she saw Tang Yu, she heaved a sigh of relief. Mr. Tang, I don't know what's going on. You've been listless all day, and you even vomited during lunch. Vomiting? Tang Yu took off his coat, threw it aside, and took the bowl from Auntie Lee. You go back first. You've worked hard. From this sentence, Auntie Lee knew that he still had feelings for Pei Chichi. There were some things she wanted to say, but she felt that it was inappropriate, so she didn't say them. After Auntie Lee left, Tang Yu opened the bedroom door with the soup in hand. A dim yellow bedside lamp was lit in the bedroom, and the whole space seemed warm. His heart was a little hot, and there were some indescribable emotions in his heart. After all, they weren't happy that night. Chapter 149. Tang Yu put down the bowl in his hand and looked at her quietly for a while. Then, he lifted the quilt and lay behind her. His big hand consciously stroked her lower abdomen. He did not take any precautions during her safe period. A young body was always very easy to conceive a child. Perhaps, there was already a child of theirs. Tang Yu's mood was a little complicated. He reached out to push her hair aside and put his face on the back of her neck. He could acutely feel that she had woken up. At that moment, Pei Chichi felt that her whole body was covered with a thin layer of sweat, and her body was stiff. The memory of that night came flooding back like a tide. She struggled a little. Tang Yu did not let go of her. Instead, he held her tight and said in a low voice, "Chichi." She struggled uneasily and said carefully, "Don't." Tang Yu hugged her whole in his arms, letting her struggle and resist. He did not dare to do anything to her. If she was pregnant, he was afraid of hurting her. However, when he thought of his rudeness that night, he still felt a little scared. Could it be hurt? 10 minutes later, Pei Chichi fell into his arms with sweat all over her body. She was already very weak. Now that she had no strength, she looked so obedient and lovable. Tang Yu carried her over and put her in his arms. He was dressed neatly, but after this ordeal, his clothes were also messy. Pei Chichi's pajamas were rolled up, so it was impossible for him not to feel it when he hugged her. Even at this moment, his body was inexplicably hot. After all, he had not touched her for a few days. However, this was not a good time. So, no matter how uncomfortable he was, he had to endure it. He hugged her and coaxed her very patiently. "Stop it." Pei Chichi struggled again. She clenched her little fists and hit him, asking him to let go. That small fist hit his shoulder gently, as if it was hitting his heart. Tang Yu had an indescribable feeling in his heart. He let her hit him. Fortunately, she did not have much strength left and was soon panting. It was hot and humid under the blanket, and her breath was really sweet. Tang Yu couldn't control himself. He lowered his head and kissed her lips. He kissed her with all his heart and held her firmly with his arms around her back. Pei Chichi couldn't avoid him and was forced to raise her little face to let him kiss her. Unable to struggle, she began to cry. Salty tears rolled between their lips and teeth. He crushed them and sucked them back into his mouth. However, he didn't dare to indulge himself too much. He stopped kissing her for a while. He presses her on his shoulder, sticks his thin lips to her ear, and says hoarsely, "It won't happen again." Pei Chichi's body froze, and she began to struggle again. He was afraid that she would hurt herself, so he immediately let go of her. "All right, have some soup. Aunt Li made it." When he got down, Pei Chichi was still lying there in a daze. Her expression looked a little dazed, as if she was not awake. Tang Yu sighed in his heart. In her heart, he was a bad guy. He sat on the bed and fed her the soup. She pursed her lips and refused. He said fiercely, "If you don't drink, we'll make it." Pei Chichi directly climbed down and slept in front of him. Tang Yu looked at the bowl in his hand helplessly. For the first time in his life, he couldn't do anything to a little girl. But what could he do? He was the one who was rough with her. He looked at her back for a long time. Chapter 150. Tang Yu's annoyance dissipated quite a bit in an instant. He smiled and laid down as well. Sticking close to her, he said hoarsely, "I rushed back from New York. I'm hungry and tired now." She didn't speak and her body was a little stiff. Tang Yu smiled and placed his finger on her stomach. "Let's sleep together." Pei Chichi endured it. After a long time, her neck was still warm, but his breathing had become even. He fell asleep. She turned her body gently and looked at his face from such a close distance for the first time. His looks were unique. He had a rare elegance, a straight nose bridge, and thin lips. Pei Chichi had heard that men with thin lips could also be fickle. Before she regained consciousness, her fingers actually touched his lips gently. "Do you want to kiss me?" Tang Yu's voice was unbelievably hoarse. Pei Chichi was shocked. She wanted to take her hand back, but he bit her little finger. She cried out in pain. Tang Yu let her go with a low chuckle. He reached out to turn on the lights. Let me see if you're hurt. He did it on purpose. Pei Chichi wanted to turn her back, but she couldn't anymore. He reached out to pull her into his arms and put her down carefully. He was so careful that it was completely different from how rough he was that night. She was so fragile in his arms, and her body was only separated by 2 thin layers of fabric. This situation made her a little afraid. Chichi, don't be afraid of me. It won't happen again. As if he could read her mind, he patted her body and pressed her down. It's my fault, he said it right next to her ear. Tang Yu had never apologized to anyone in his life, let alone a woman. Pei Chichi wasn't a particularly unreasonable person. He had indeed been rough with her, but with her status, he could do whatever he wanted to her. She didn't say anything in response, but her body softened a little. Tang Yu smiled and pinched her cheeks with his big hands. Good girl. They were in a good relationship, and they were both adults. Moreover, he hadn't hugged her for a few days, so he was tempted. If it weren't for Auntie Lee's words, he might have coaxed her to come. In the end, he sighed and brought the soup over. He tasted it and found that it was still hot. Hurry up and drink some. Pei Chichi didn't want to drink, but she was afraid that he was really going to do something. She took a small sip. I can't drink anymore. Listening to this voice, it sounded really delicate. Tang Yu smiled and drank it himself. He was a man who couldn't stand the smell of sweat. After coaxing her to sleep, he carefully got up to wash off the dust on his body. After changing into his bathrobe, he was a little hungry. He couldn't possibly ask his little girl to get up and serve him, right? Tang Yu went to the kitchen and looked around. In the end, he gave up. He poured himself a glass of red wine, drank it, and lay down. He only felt that she was especially gentle, and he wanted to make it up to her. However, Tang Yu later found out that Pei Chichi's submissive and obedient behavior today was because she only treated him as the woman he had bought. Just like what he said, and when she really fell in love with him, she would never forgive him for treating her like this. Never. She would kill him. Early in the morning, Tang Yu woke up first. He turned his body and looked at the young lady beside him. Chapter 151. Tang Yu quietly watched for a while, then quietly got up, changed into casual clothes, and went to the pharmacy outside. The pharmacy was very quiet in the morning. When Tang Yu walked in, a few shop assistants were talking about trivial matters. When they saw Tang Yu, their mouths opened wide. Oh my God, so handsome. He was even taller and more handsome than that Li Mingao. His gaze was like a laser light, scanning 360 degrees, wishing he could see through it. Sir, what do you need? The middle-aged shop assistant gently touched the Tsunamoto Platinum 001 on the shelf and blinked. There's a promotion, buy 5 get 1 free. Tang Yu glanced at it and coughed lightly. I need to buy something to use after this loses its effect. Don't look down on it because it's thin. It definitely won't break or leak. When the shop assistant saw such a handsome man, he felt as if he was a withered tree in spring, an old tree that was blooming. Tang Yu didn't say anything. That woman covered her mouth. Oh my God, it broke? Oh my God. He's too strong. Her gaze, as well as the gazes of the other women, all fell on a certain spot on Tang Yu's body. Their fiery gazes could almost burn through his pant. You don't have it? Tang Yu asked unhappily. The shop assistant swallowed hard. Yes, we have it for 24 hours and 72 hours. Pregnancy test kit. Tang Yu said impatiently. Pregnancy test kit. Not killing a small life. So caring. You're actually unwilling to kill a small life. There are so many cute tadpoles, the handsome one should be different, right? The shop assistant walked in with a blushing face and took the most expensive one. This one is especially accurate. Tang Yu reached into his pocket and took out 100 yuan from his wallet. He didn't change it and quickly left. The shop assistant's eyes were pink. What a pure and innocent handsome guy. After this incident, Tang Yu felt a little embarrassed and smoked a cigarette downstairs. Of course, he could let Ching Cheng or Xiao Ran handle this kind of thing, but he just didn't want to. He didn't want others to know about such a private matter, especially when it was Chichi who had a child with him. After smoking, he threw the cigarette butt and stepped on it to put it out, then went upstairs. Pei Chichi didn't wake up, and the bedroom was quiet. Tang Yu sat by the bed and patted her little face. Chichi. She slowly opened her eyes, and when she saw him, her pupils shrank. Of course, he could feel it. Without batting an eyelid, he said, "I'm going to the bathroom." He paused. "I put a cup there, you." The voice at the back was very soft, but Pei Chichi still understood. Her little face was a little pale, and she almost stopped breathing. It seemed like hers was late for 2 days and did not come. That might not be the case. Tang Yu lowered his voice, but deep down, he was actually looking forward to it. Pei Chichi looked at him for a long time before she slowly got up and walked to the bathroom. Pei Chichi looked at him for a long time before she slowly got up and walked to the bathroom. When Tang Yu saw this, he couldn't help but feel a little disappointed. He was startled and reached out to touch her little head. There will be more chances in the future. When Tang Yu saw it, he couldn't help but feel a little disappointed. He was stunned and reached out to touch her little head. There will be more chances in the future. Pei Chichi bit her lip and said softly, "We always have protection." She didn't know what she had done to offend him. Could it be that he would be happy if she was pregnant with his child? She didn't know how she had offended him. Would he be happy if she was pregnant with his child? Tang Yu was helpless. "Pei Chichi, how many times have you taken leave in the past month?" Chapter 152. Of course, he was talking about her studies. "Do you want to stay back for a year?" She was already 23 years old when she graduated. If she stayed back for a year, she would be 24. He actually cared about his age. Pei Chichi didn't say anything and just lay there. He was a little worried. He walked over and touched her forehead, asking gently, "What's wrong?" Pei Chichi was silent for a while before saying, "My stomach is bloated." She paused. "Maybe it's because I bled a few days ago, so I haven't been feeling well." Tang Yu's heart skipped a beat. She was still young and hadn't experienced those things many times. She was probably really hurt after what he did that night. Moreover, he left her on a business trip. He felt really guilty now. He reached out and gently stroked her hair. "I'll arrange work in the morning and take you to the hospital in the afternoon." "No." She looked up at him. It was too embarrassing, and she was afraid of other people looking at her strangely. Tang Yu kissed her. "Then I'll get the doctor to come." "Be good." Pei Chichi grunted and fell back into a deep sleep. Auntie Li came over and made breakfast. She didn't dare to disturb them and left. Tang Yu was about to go to the bedroom when someone knocked on the door. He thought it was Auntie Li and opened the door, but it was his mother, Lin Yun, standing outside. Tang Yu was a little surprised. "Mom, I'm at the office. The second secretary said you're back. Why didn't you go to work?" Lin Yun walked in. Tang Yu closed the door slowly and poured a glass of water for Lin Yun. "Chichi isn't feeling well. Is it, that girl?" Lin Yun probably came to see Pei Chichi. She had more or less gotten some information from Xiao Ran. Tang Yu nodded. Lin Yun didn't drink the tea. Instead, she stood up and smiled. "Let's go see her then." Tang Yu didn't want to stop his mother's request. However, this kind of thing made him a little uncomfortable. "Mom, how about next time? Chichi is still asleep." "She's asleep, so there's nothing bad about it." Lin Yun glanced at her son and walked in. Tang Yu followed behind. In the bedroom, a cool fragrance floated, and it smelled very comfortable. Lin Yun sat on the edge of the bed and pushed aside some of the blankets. When she saw Pei Chichi's face, she couldn't help but freeze. But then, her gaze was attracted by the object hanging on Pei Chichi's chest. She recognized it. It was her mother's item. Her mother had told her that when Tang Yu met a girl he liked and wanted to spend the rest of his life with her, he should give this to her. In the past, when Shen Lian and Tang Yu were so close, Tang Yu had never had any thoughts about her. How long has this girl been with Tang Yu? She roughly knew how important Pei Chichi was in Tang Yu's heart. She quietly put down her hand and turned to look at Tang Yu. How did she get sick? Tang Yu didn't say anything, but his face was red. How could he not know his own son? Lin Yun stood up and walked out while glaring at him. How can you not be gentle? How old is the girl? Then, she thought for a moment. Let Dr. Mai come over. Don't let her get sick. As she said that, she was a little angry. You've already hung that thing on her. Why aren't you careful? Don't you want children in the future? Tang Yu smiled faintly. I'll be careful in the future. Lin Yun knew that it wasn't convenient for her to stay. She was afraid that the girl would feel uncomfortable when she woke up. Chapter 153. Tang Yu walked her to the door. Lin Yun turned around and said, "Bring Chichi to my place when you're free." Even though they looked similar, she still felt, but Lin Yun was still optimistic. It was mainly because her son liked her, and it was rare to see Tang Yu like a girl so much and settle down so quickly. Lin Yun thought about it and said, "She's still in school, right? Be careful and don't have any children in the next few years. It's not good for young girls." Tang Yu smiled faintly. "I know." After sending his mother off, Dr. Mai came less than an hour later. Lin Yun must have called him personally. Pei Chichi was awake, and Tang Yu held her in his arms to examine her. Dr. Mai understood everything. After a quick examination, he said that the wound was a little inflamed and that it should be fine after taking some medicine. Of course, he also reminded Tang Yu to control himself. Pei Chichi didn't have the face to listen, but Tang Yu agreed. After sending the doctor off, Pei Chichi ignored him for a while. Tang Yu looked at the little girl helplessly. He couldn't hit her, scold her, or touch her. She had to rest for at least 10 days. After feeding her some breakfast, he ate some for himself and dealt with work in the study. When it was almost noon, Auntie Lee called. Something happened at home and she couldn't come. Tang Yu didn't make things difficult for her and hung up. But lunch was a little difficult. He thought about it and went to the kitchen to take a look, but he had never done this before. He had only barely learned how to make porridge last time. He looked at it and wondered if he should ask someone to send food over. Pei Chichi stood at the door and said quietly, "Let me do it." Tang Yu looked at her. Her little face was still a little pale, but she seemed to be in better spirits. He smiled faintly. "Okay." Pei Chichi walked over quietly, took out the ingredients from the fridge, and carefully processed them. Tang Yu stood at the side and watched. Her fingers were fair, and even when she was cooking, it was still very pleasing to the eye. His gaze moved up to her small neck, which was incredibly soft and tender. In a moment of passion, he walked behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. He rested his face on her shoulder. "Chichi, have we reconciled?" She froze, then went back to chopping vegetables. Tang Yu chuckled hoarsely and kissed her artery. Finally, he held her little face and kissed her deeply. She did not respond, nor did she resist. She let him kiss her, let him take away the things in her hands, let him carry her onto the counter. Stuck in the middle, he cupped her little face and kissed her tightly, until her little toes curled up. He let go of her, but his forehead was still pressed against hers. Lowering his eyes, he gazed at her beautiful face. "Chichi, well said." Her breathing was a little erratic and she did not dare to look at him. Although he was very gentle, she could feel his strong power. She grunted. Tang Yu looked at her and lowered his head to kiss her again. This time, he carried her directly to the bedroom. When they closed the door, Pei Chichi bit his shoulder. "You can't." "I know, I'll be careful." "I won't do it for real." He comforted her and murmured. In the end, lunch was sent over by the restaurant, and it was at 4 in the afternoon. At night, Pei Chichi lay in his arms and said calmly, "I want to visit Dad tomorrow." Chapter 154. Her lips moved, but she didn't say anything. At this point, he really shouldn't mention anything else, but he still couldn't control himself. He lifted her little face and gazed deeply into her eyes. No matter what happened in the past, forget it in the future. Pei Chichi's gaze was a little fluttering. She wanted to escape, but he pinched her little chin and pulled her closer to him. They were so close that they could almost see each other's reflections in their eyes. "Tang Yu." She called his name. At this moment, her heart was beating really fast. It was an indescribable feeling. She was even afraid, as though something had broken out of a cocoon. But she suppressed it. She didn't want to know. Tang Yu hugged her and sighed. Forget it, it's not your fault. There was nothing wrong with liking someone. It was just that before he met her, she had fallen in love with someone else. That person just happened to be Jinrong. Pei Chichi was hugged in his arms. His masculine aura enveloped her. His scent was everywhere. She wanted to hide, but she couldn't. It was as though there was only one Tang Yu in this world. She couldn't squeeze out another person. Her little face was nestled in his chest, listening to his powerful heartbeat. She shrank back and wanted to escape, but his large palm pressed her down tightly. His voice was a little hot. Chichi, he seemed to want to say something, but he didn't. Instead, he kissed her passionately again. Kissed again. Pei Chichi looked up and placed her little hand on his shoulder. Looking at her face that was full of tolerance, Tang Yu chuckled and reached out to pinch her little nose, letting her go. Pei Chichi stayed like that for about a week. On the third day, he sent her to see Pei Ming. Pei Chichi went in alone. It wasn't convenient for Tang Yu to follow her, so he waited for her in the corridor while smoking. Pei Ming was about to be discharged. He was better than before, but he could only say some simple words. His spirit and appearance were not the same as before. Pei Chichi stood there, looking at him, feeling a wave of sadness in her heart. Dad, I've come to see you. Pei Chichi sat down and reached out to hold Pei Ming's rough fingers. His hands, which used to be so powerful, were now powerless. Pei Ming looked at her and recognized her. He also wanted to say something, but after moving his lips for half a day, no words came out. Tears welled up in his old eyes as he looked at her silently. This reminded Pei Chichi of the eyes of animals when they were old, and she felt a lump in her throat. My father used to be so strong. She leaned over and whispered in his ear, the company is fine. She knew that Pei Ming was concerned, so she reassured him. Pei Ming slowly turned his head and looked at Pei Chichi. His eyes seemed to light up. In fact, the one he was most worried about was Chichi. She didn't know what his arrangement would bring her in the end, but if it was handed over to Ju Mailin, the company might immediately become the gigolos. He couldn't accept it. Pei Ming's eyes were wide open as he looked straight in a certain direction. Pei Chichi's fingers tightened on him. Dad, he moved, his lips trembling. After a long time, he finally called out her name. Chi. Chi. Pei Chichi looked at him with tears in her eyes. It's me, I'm Chichi. Pei Ming's fingers moved, and suddenly he had the strength to hold her hand tightly. Chapter 155. Pei Chichi had been inside for more than an hour, and Tang Yu had also finished smoking 7 or 8 cigarettes. He didn't smoke often, but there seemed to be nothing else he could do at this moment. Suddenly, he narrowed his eyes and looked at the person who was walking towards him. It was Lin Jinrong. Lin Jinrong walked straight towards him. Without saying a word, he directly punched Tang Yu. Tang Yu didn't dodge, and his body was knocked to the side. At the same time, there was a trace of bruise at the corner of his mouth, and there was a faint trace of blood. I thought you would treat her well, Lin Jinrong said coldly. Dr. Mai had gone to the Lin family. She didn't really come out, but she had inadvertently revealed the information that Lin Jinrong pieced together and found out. Tang Yu had actually injured Pei Chichi. Tang Yu stood up straight and patted his slightly wrinkled clothes. Jinrong, I don't need to explain to you what happened between me and her. Lin Jinrong stood up straight, and there was anger on his face. But I liked her 2 years earlier than you. Tang Yu was still indifferent. Don't forget that you're going to get married soon. You're going to marry Pei Chichi's sister. His voice suddenly became stern. Jinrong, have you ever thought that your inability to let go might hurt her? Really? Lin Jinrong stared at him. This was the first time he had spoken to his idol like this since he was young. What about you? Besides buying her and using force on her, what else have you done to her? Tang Yu was slightly angry. That's between me and her. He wouldn't argue with a child. So he didn't fight back. But the more indifferent he was, the angrier Lin Jinrong was. If you can't give her happiness, then return her to me. He looked up and laughed mockingly. 100 million, right? I'll give it to you. Tang Yu's face was a little pale. Jinrong, do you know what you're saying? Lin Jinrong was about to speak when Pei Chichi stood at the door of the ward. She looked at them with a pale face. Her lips moved as if she wanted to say something, but in the end, not a single word came out. She slowly walked over to Tang Yu and raised her head. Tang Yu didn't move. He just stared at her. Her little hand slowly rose and touched the corner of his mouth. That soft touch soothed his wound. Suddenly, Tang Yu grabbed her little hand. Pei Chichi lowered her head and looked at. She let him lead her to the elevator and did not refuse. He brushed past Lin Jinrong. Lin Jinrong looked at Tang Yu holding Pei Chichi's hand in a daze. Tang Yu was right. His love for Pei Chichi might be a burden. She had let go of it, so what else could he not let go of? However, if he let go of his love so easily, what kind of love was that? Lin Jinrong raised his head and suddenly laughed. In the elevator, Pei Chichi looked at Tang Yu and asked softly, "Does it hurt? Do you want to go to the hospital?" He looked down at her and said hoarsely, "Pei Chichi, this is the hospital." She looked at him helplessly. "It's just a small injury." He reached out and touched her head. "You're not going to school today?" Pei Chichi nodded. His fingers held her little hand tightly. "Then come with me to the office." She just remembered that she was still an intern in his company. Tang Yu glanced at her and held her hand as they got into the car. He was driving himself, so he naturally opened the door to the front passenger seat for her to get in. After he got in, he buckled the seatbelt and pulled down the mirror to look at himself. Chapter 156. However, he didn't want to mention Jinrong in front of Pei Chichi, so he didn't say anything. By the time they reached the office, it was already an hour later. Along the way, he saw many young ladies lining up in front of an ice cream shop, so he asked Pei Chichi to buy one. Pei Chichi got into the car and gave him the change and the ice cream. "Eat it." He looked at the change and smiled. "This is for the little girl's pocket money. Shouldn't you thank Big Brother?" Pei Chichi's face blushed slightly as she looked at the beautiful ice cream in a daze. She couldn't bear to eat such a beautiful thing. "What's wrong?" Tang Yu talked to her as he drove, but his eyes were focused on the road ahead. Pei Chichi pursed her lips and didn't say anything. Tang Yu stretched out his hand and patted her head. "Eat less. It's not good to eat too much." He seemed to have thought of something when he said the last few words, so his voice was a little hoarse. Pei Chichi lowered her head, guessing what he meant. From her ears to her neck, there was a faint blush, and it was beautiful. It was a red light. Tang Yu turned his head and looked at her, his eyes moving down slowly. He laughed silently. "Chichi, do you know that you're very cute?" Cute? She didn't think so. If he thought she was cute, he wouldn't have treated her like that night. Tang Yu looked at her and could roughly guess what she was thinking. He sighed. "I'll never be able to appeal, right?" The green light turned green. When he started the car, he sighed again. "Chichi, do the same to me next time." Pei Chichi looked up and couldn't believe her ears. Didn't he say that? She was in a daze again. When they arrived at Shengyuan Building, Tang Yu stopped the car and took a piece of tissue from the box to wipe her lips. "Get out of the car." Pei Chichi looked at the thing in her hands. She had only eaten half of it. He took it, opened the car door, and threw it into the trash can outside. Then he waited for her there. "Come here." Pei Chichi walked over. Her hand was caught by him, and they walked straight inside. Along the way, Sheng Yuan's employees respectfully greeted the president and Miss Pei. It seemed that from now on, Pei Chichi was no longer that little working student, but Tang Yu acknowledged her as his girlfriend. She resisted, but she couldn't hide. He never said anything, he just did it so that she couldn't resist. It was as if he had spun a net. She fell into it, and he slowly retracted it. From body to heart. As a diversified multinational corporation, Tang Yu was naturally very busy. As soon as they reached the top floor, Xiao Ran immediately entered the office and reported the day's schedule. Occasionally, he took the time to glance at Pei Chichi, who was sitting on the sofa. Sure enough, they had reconciled. And it was even better than before. Xiao Ran thought to herself. "I've chosen the right side." Tang Yu raised his hand. Reschedule the meeting to the afternoon. Don't arrange anything in the morning. Also, bring a first aid kit over. He changed his mind and said to Pei Chichi, Chichi, you and Xiao Ran can go get it. Xiao Ran sharply caught the difference. Usually, when Tang Yu called her, he would call her Secretary Ran. But when he talked to Pei Chichi, he directly called her Xiao Ran. There was a huge difference. She was almost sure that Pei Chichi would be half her master in the future. Chapter 157. Xiao Ran was a veteran in the workplace and he was Tang Yu's man. He didn't know how to flatter others, but he was very careful with his words. He would remind her when he was being polite. He placed a small medical kit in Pei Chichi's hands and smiled. CEO, you're very busy. Please understand. Pei Chichi could tell there was something different in his tone, but she didn't explain. Back in Tang Yu's office, she closed the door gently and leaned against it. She watched as Tang Yu flipped through the documents. He had taken off his coat and was only wearing a white shirt and black trousers, which made him look very elegant and noble. Especially the diamond buttons on his sleeves, which were faintly discernible. His every movement was very pleasing to the eye. She didn't understand why a man like him would buy her. As she was thinking about it, Tang Yu's voice rang out. Come and help me apply the medicine. He got up and sat down on the sofa. Then he looked at Pei Chichi, who was standing at the door. Pei Chichi felt embarrassed that she had been caught. She quickly walked over and sat next to him. She opened the medical kit and looked up at his wound. Have you treated someone's wound before? He asked suddenly. Pei Chichi was stunned for a moment. Then she smiled and said in a low voice, I've treated myself. And many times. Tang Yu's eyes narrowed and his heart twitched. That indescribable pain spread to all the nerves in his body. He looked at her lowered face and asked in a hoarse voice, was it hard in the past? Pei Chichi suddenly raised her eyes and looked at him. There was a hint of confusion in her eyes. Apart from Pei Ming, no one had ever cared if she was having a hard time. The past flashed through her mind. Finally, she lowered her head and said softly, it's okay. Tang Yu sighed. How could it be okay? If it was okay, she wouldn't have been sold to him. He touched her long black hair and said, it won't be hard anymore in the future. Pei Chichi cleverly didn't reply and focused on treating his wound. She also cleverly didn't ask about him being beaten up by Lin Jinrong. Her technique was very skillful, so skillful that it made his heart ache. He always felt that Zhu Meilin had gotten lucky last time. His fingers suddenly caught her little hand. He didn't say a word and just stared intently at her little face. Pei Chichi smiled. When I was young, I was often beaten when my father wasn't around. Later on, I became smart. Every time I was beaten, I deliberately let Auntie hit me on the face. My father would ask her if he saw it. As she spoke, she looked at Tang Yu. Under such a gaze, Mr. Tang was almost embarrassed. He coughed lightly and said, you were quite thoughtful when you were young. Well, that's what happens when you get beaten up often, she said as she put away the medicine box. Well, it's pretty good. Beautiful. Tang Yu only felt that her technique was very good, and he almost didn't feel any pain. As soon as she said that, he went to the bathroom to take a look. The corner of his mouth had been exaggeratedly smeared with purple medicine. It was very eye-catching. Pei Chichi followed him and leaned against the door. She smiled lightly and said, you were the one who said that I could do this to you once. Tang Yu was stunned and then shook his head. Pei Chichi, how dare you? But she was already very bold. He still had a meeting in the afternoon. How was he going to face others after she made the corner of his mouth look like that? Moreover, she had smeared a purple heart shape on the wound. Chapter 158. Because of what happened last time, he didn't dare to be too rough. Instead, he carefully pressed her against the wall and put one arm behind her head. His handsome face slowly approached. You should do this. Hurt me. His voice was bewitching. It became softer and softer until it finally disappeared from the corner of her mouth. He sucked on her lips and kissed her endlessly gently. She didn't resist. This kiss gradually became more intense, and the result was that his wound became more serious. Tang Yu let out a muffled groan and let go of her. He panted heavily and looked at her. He said meaningfully, "It hurts a little." He pressed his forehead against hers, enveloping her in his breath. His hand reached over and closed the bathroom door. In this small world, there was only him and her. Pei Chichi didn't dare to look up. Her long eyelashes fluttered incessantly, looking extremely adorable. He lowered his head and pressed it against those fluttering eyelashes. There was a slight sting on his lips, and there was a strange feeling that seemed to pierce into his heart. Pei Chichi's hands were flat on the tiles behind her, and her body was pressed against the wall behind her. Tang Yu grabbed her little hands and placed them on his shoulders. His voice was so hot that it sounded like he had a mouthful of sand in his mouth. "Hug me." Pei Chichi refused. She squirmed and wanted to retract her little hands, but he chuckled and forced her to hug him. For Tang Yu, the most wonderful place in the world was the bathroom. There was no other place he could go. He didn't do anything else. He just hugged her and teased her. What happened in the past few days? His finger gently touched her little nose. Actually, he could guess from Jinrong's behavior that something must have happened. At least, Jinrong had met her before. Pei Chichi raised her little face and looked at his handsome face. She was a little absent-minded. In Xia City, he was the financial backer who bought her. She needed to serve him carefully at all times. In his office, he was the high and mighty CEO of Shengyuan, and he was so far away from her. But now, they were in the bathroom. This place was so small that she could even deliberately hurt him here. Here she was his equal. She took the initiative to lean her face against his chest. This was the first time she took the initiative to throw herself into his embrace. Tang Yu's body stiffened and he couldn't believe it. "Tang Yu, Dad will be like this from now on. He can't speak, and he can't walk." Her voice was soft. "Although he's not as strong as you, and sometimes he's weak, he protected me." Tang Yu reached out and patted her. "I'll find the best doctor." Pei Chichi buried her face deeper. "Thank you." He lifted his body slightly and looked at the child in his arms. His heart was unbelievably soft. Pei Chichi's little hand slowly moved from his shoulder to the back of his neck, hugging him tightly. "And my best friend slept with Pei Huan's man," she said. Tang Yu patted her butt. "Do you care?" His voice was obviously dangerous. If she dared to say that she cared, she probably wouldn't be able to walk out of the bathroom today. Pei Chichi looked up and bit her lips. Her eyes were misty. "I just think they're so messy." Chapter 159. As he spoke, his big palm started to move a little. Pei Chichi blushed. "What are you doing? Keep your voice down. Xiao Ran will enter the office at any time." He threatened her abominably. Pei Chichi didn't dare to make a sound. In fact, he didn't do anything. He just pressed her down and kissed her. When he let go of her, Pei Chichi's legs were weak. Indeed, the bathroom of a big company was a dirty place. The CEO's bathroom was even dirtier, but the most dirty place was the CEO's lounge. Pei Chichi and Tang Yu hadn't tried it yet. When Pei Chichi went out, she saw the ridiculously big bed. It was the size of a king. Tang Yu suddenly turned his head and habitually assumed the posture of a superior. "Do you want to try it?" "No need," she said obediently. "Thank you for your kindness." He chuckled. "Pei Chichi, it's not a kind gesture." His voice became low. "It's not a kind gesture for a man to pull a girl to his bed." Seeing that she was biting her lip again, he patted her. "But you're a kid, so you can be given special treatment." "I'm not a kid." Pei Chichi couldn't stand it when he called her that. It was a loving title, but she just felt uneasy. Just now in the bathroom, it seemed that they had crossed the line. Tang Yu's gaze was profound. "If you don't need special treatment, I'm all for it." His gaze swept over her body and gradually moved down. Then, it landed somewhere. "You're indeed not a kid." Pei Chichi had never seen anyone switch between being a gentleman and being shameless so naturally. In fact, up until now, Tang Yu had always been a gentleman to other women. But for Pei Chichi, he was completely shameless and a rogue. Think about it. They had even taken off their clothes together. Why would he still need to pretend to be a calm elite? Isn't that a little too boring? After messing around for a while, it was almost noon. Tang Yu was not in the mood to work, so he asked Pei Chichi to order lunch from a restaurant he often went to across the street. He took a pocketbook from his coat pocket and handed it to her. Pei Chichi did not dare to take it. She carefully opened it and took out 3 100 yuan notes. It might not be enough. Tang Yu smiled and gave her 2 more cards. His voice was a little low. Go to the pharmacy and buy 2 boxes of Tsunomoto Platinum 001. Pei Chichi didn't know what he wanted, so she asked again. Tang Yu dragged her over and placed her in his arms. His voice was very soft. Do whatever you like, little girl. Pei Chichi blushed. She took the money and walked out quietly. In the elevator, she saw that her face was unbelievably red. When she closed her eyes, she saw Tang Yu's handsome yet devilish face. She must have been crazy to keep thinking of him. She went to the pharmacy and bought that. The look in the shop assistant's eyes made her feel a little ashamed. She left in a hurry without looking at the size. She put it in her backpack and clutched it tightly as if she had robbed a bank. After buying the food, she went back to Tang Yu's office. The way Mr. Tang looked at her was especially meaningful. Pei Chichi pretended not to notice it as she ate. He was very busy in the afternoon. She read for a while and then lingered on the bed in the lounge. When Tang Yu came back, he saw a sleeping beauty. Her long black hair was spread all over the pillow. Her face was rosy and soft from sleep, and one of her hands was on the quilt. She was beautiful no matter how he looked at her. Chapter 160. Tang Yu stood there admiring the flowers for a while. Xiao Ran's voice came from behind. CEO, these documents need to be signed. Tang Yu nodded and closed the door. After sitting down, Xiao Ran flipped through the documents page by page. He signed them and put the pen on. Before Xiao Ran left, Tang Yu coughed lightly. Secretary Xiao, what do girls usually like? Xiao Ran held the documents and thought for a moment. All girls like flowers. Tang Yu nodded and said calmly, let's go. Xiao Ran blinked. Did the CEO just burn the bridge after crossing the river? Of course, she wouldn't ask because she was sure that the CEO wanted to send Pei Chichi. After Xiao Ran left, Tang Yu went to the lounge every half an hour. This kid could really sleep. He laughed silently. At 4 o'clock, he pressed the internal line to summon his omnipotent secretary. Order a bouquet of white roses for me, Tang Yu said calmly. Xiao Ran took a note. CEO, where? Tang Yu looked at her. Let's do it here. Xiao Ran understood and immediately went out to do it. The flowers arrived at 5 o'clock. Pei Chichi had just woken up. She had been especially sleepy lately. He didn't know why. If Tang Yu hadn't tested her, he would have suspected that she was pregnant. And her period had been delayed for a few days, but it still hadn't come. He was thinking if he should find a day to get Dr. Mai to do a proper check on her. Maybe it was because he didn't control himself last time. On the one hand, he really liked her. On the other hand, he wanted to make it up to her. He had been very good to her recently. What happened that night seemed to have faded away. No one mentioned it again. Pei Chichi looked at the white roses in front of her and blinked. For me. She hugged the flowers, and he half carried her as they walked out. He watched as she buried her face in the flowers, inhaling the fragrance. Be careful, there are many bugs in the flowers. Pei Chichi ignored him and continued to hug him. Every girl will have a dream. Her sweetheart will give her 99 roses. But she didn't expect that person to be Tang Yu. On the way back, he took a detour and asked her to visit Pei Ming at the hospital again. She would be lying if she said she wasn't touched. Plus, she knew that he had once wanted to give her 20 million yuan. Pei Chichi knew Tang Yu's character. He hated Zhu Mailin so much that he was willing to do this. It was impossible for her not to know why he did it. Even when he used violence on her, she also knew why he did it. But she really couldn't bear his kindness. She really didn't want to owe him so much anymore. After leaving the hospital, she got into the car and said in a low voice, Tang Yu, don't be too nice to me. I can't afford it. He looked at her sitting in the back seat. The moment she came back, she was hugging the bouquet of white roses. Suddenly, Tang Yu thought of a phrase to describe her current state. Although her mouth said no, her body was very honest. He only smiled and didn't say anything. Chichi, I'm not asking you to return it. His voice lowered. I'm very sorry for what happened last time. She shook her head, a little out of sorts. Once again, she felt that they had crossed the line. It shouldn't be like this. They shouldn't be like this. Her pupils constricted. She suddenly realized, did she fall in love with him? Tang Yu looked at her in the rearview mirror and smiled. Chichi, what's wrong? She came back to her senses. Nothing. What are we eating tonight? Chapter 161. When they got home, she ate the noodles. After he finished eating, he went into the study and even took Pei Chichi away. He wanted her to accompany him, so she could only accompany him. She flipped through the book absent-mindedly and looked up at him from time to time. Chichi, if you keep looking at me like that, I might not be able to read these documents. Tang Yu did not look up but smiled faintly. Pei Chichi immediately lowered her head and pretended to be very busy. However, he raised his eyes, and there was a faint smile on his handsome face. Forget it. He suddenly stood up, reached out and put her on his lap. Pei Chichi was a little scared being carried by him like that. Tang Yu. Her voice was soft and gentle. It was the first time he liked his name so much. He let her call it, and it was indescribably gentle. He lowered his head and kissed her little mouth. Call me that again. Pei Chichi raised her head to look at him. Being kissed on the lips like this, she was more or less unable to control her emotions. Her eyes were lowered, and her expression was indescribably gentle. Tang. He kissed the last word into his mouth. His slender fingers cupped her little face and rubbed it gently. The texture between his fingers and her delicate skin made contact, and Pei Chichi felt a little itchy and a little numb. Tang Yu kissed her deeply for a while before he withdrew and said in a hoarse voice, "Where are the things I bought today?" Sitting in his arms, Pei Chichi's body, which was as soft as water, suddenly stiffened. Tang Yu patted her little butt. Go get them. His voice was already unbelievably hoarse. Pei Chichi bit her lip. Her lips were bright and glistening because of his kiss. Tang Yu kissed her and said in a hoarse voice, "Baby, be good." She was not. Pei Chichi walked out very slowly, and came back even slower. He waited for a full 10 minutes. Pei Chichi held a small box in her little hand and placed it behind her back. She stood in front of him, her hair a little messy. After being kissed, her eyes were like silk and her thin shoulders were fragrant and alluring. Tang Yu was not a saint. He had only wanted to tease her, but now he was moved. As he kissed her, he opened the package with one hand. Pei Chichi gasped. Tang Yu. This is the study. Besides, Dr. Mai said that they couldn't. I've asked, it's okay. He whispered as he kissed her. Pei Chichi still couldn't accept it. This is the study, and he seemed to have made up his mind to do the most erotic things in the most sacred place, to seal her little mouth and not let her speak any more. However, 5 minutes later, Tang Yu raised his eyebrows and looked at the 001 in his hand, alternate account. His gaze fell on Pei Chichi's little face. She curled up, but where could she go? She was still in his arms. She leaned on his shoulder weakly and peeked her little face out. I don't know, you must have tried. It was rare for Tang Yu to be so playful. He took a small bite of her seductively. Am I an alternate account? Pei Chichi was forced into a corner. Her little face rested on his shoulder, and her voice was also weak. I really don't know. At this moment, Tang Yu didn't have the mood to do that. He hugged her and lectured her naughtily. Next time, buy a bigger account, okay? Pei Chichi didn't know where she got the courage from. Next time, you can buy it yourself. Tang Yu smiled and patted her to get her up. Okay. Pei Chichi felt that something was wrong. She thought about it for a moment and then blushed. She seemed to be begging him to take her. Chapter 162. After the shower, he let her sleep on his shoulder. He turned on his bedside lamp and flipped through a document. He actually wanted to do something, but he was still worried about her health. It felt good to have her in his arms. He patted her gently as he flipped through the document. The phone by the bed rang. He picked it up immediately, speaking in English in a low voice. He turned to look at Pei Chichi. She wasn't awake. Tang Yu took the phone and walked to the French window to answer the call. His voice was low, but Pei Chichi could still understand. He was contacting a specialist overseas to consult about Pei Ming's illness. He had already sent a copy of the medical records and scans over 2 days ago. Tang Yu talked in detail for about 10 minutes before he hung up the phone. He lifted the blanket and sat next to her. He brushed away the stray hair on her forehead with his long fingers, put the document aside and lay down. Pei Chichi suddenly turned around and hugged his waist. "Thank you, Tang Yu." She buried her face in his chest. Her voice was muffled, but he still heard it. Hugging her petite body, he smiled faintly. Sleep. The next morning, when Pei Chichi woke up, Tang Yu was already dressed and wearing his watch. She realized that he was wearing the same watch as hers. Pei Chichi wrapped herself in the blanket and wrinkled her nose. Childish. Tang Yu suddenly turned around and looked at her. Then, he leaned forward and kissed her little mouth. His voice was husky. Really? It was too late for Pei Chichi to regret it. Men were especially beastly in the morning, even if it wasn't 0:01, he still made contact with her twice. After that, Tang Yu carried her to take a shower. She bit him on the shoulder. Pei Chichi, seeing you like this makes me want to be childish again. He patted her. Hurry up and get dressed if you don't want to repeat a year. Pei Chichi bit her lips, her legs felt weak, perhaps to make it up to her, he was especially gentle this time. In the end, it took a very long time. Pei Chichi looked at the time. It was already 10 o'clock. She bit him again. She didn't care how childish he was. Anyway, she couldn't make it in time for class. Tang Yu's heart softened. He helped her put on her clothes. I'll send you there. Be a good girl and stop fooling around. I'm not. She pursed her lips and suddenly said, My dad is discharged today. Tang Yu was silent. Pei Ming's discharge meant that Jinrong and Pei Huan were getting married. However, Pei Ming would not attend. He reached out and patted Pei Chichi's head. Come with me tomorrow. Pei Chichi looked up and called out his name slowly, Tang Yu. He reached out and ruffled her hair. It'll be fine. She stood by his side and was pulled into his shoulder. For a moment, Pei Chichi really wanted to rely on him like this for the rest of her life. If her mother wasn't Zhao Ku, she thought, she would really be willing. He drove her to school, and Pei Chichi got out of the car and watched him leave. At first, she was worried that she would be scolded for being late, but from the teachers to the students, everyone was polite. Today, because Pei Chichi was standing by Tang Yu's side, no one dared to look down on her. After class, when they walked out of the classroom, Pei Chichi bumped into Chen Xinjie. After a few days, Chen Xinjie looked very haggard. Chapter 163. Pei Chichi turned her head and stood still, her face expressionless. Chen Xinjie stared into her eyes. Pei Chichi, you must be feeling very proud now. What's there for me to be proud of? Pei Chichi smiled faintly. Chen Xinjie's voice was a little shrill. Aren't you proud of seeing me like Lin Jinrong and seeing me in such a sorry state? No one forced you to like him, and no one forced you to be friends with me. Pei Chichi said coldly, just like how you still want people to think that you're innocent after all you've done, right? Chen Xinjie laughed. Pei Chichi, I just didn't expect you to be so lucky. Did you know that I was the one who suggested to Pei Huan to take down Lin Jinrong that night? To me, I'd rather Lin Jinrong and Pei Huan be together than you and him being in love. I was also the one who told Pei Huan to sell you. Chen Xinjie's face looked a little crazy. But I didn't expect you to bump into Tang Yu's room. Isn't it the same as selling me? Pei Chichi sneered. Chen Xinjie was stunned. She took a step back and said, I don't believe that you don't have any feelings for him, Pei Chichi. If that's the case, you're the one without a heart. Pei Chichi walked forward slowly. She leaned closer to Chen Xinjie. Her voice was very soft, but every word was knocking on Chen Xinjie's heart. I don't have a heart because it's been eaten by dogs. Pei Chichi straightened her body after saying that. Chen Xinjie's face was ashen. Suddenly, she laughed and said, Pei Chichi, let's wait and see you get abandoned. How could a man like Tang Yu tolerate you not having him in your heart? However, how could Chen Xinjie know what Pei Chichi was thinking? Even Pei Chichi couldn't figure it out. His good, his bad, completely confused her. She didn't even know herself. The day of Pei Huan's wedding, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Tang Yu asked someone to send her here to have her hair styled. As a close relative of the Lin family, he naturally had to attend. Pei Chichi looked at herself in the mirror. With a thin layer of makeup, her originally fair face was dyed with a layer of scarlet. She knew that she was beautiful, but she had never been so glamorous before. Vaguely, she saw Zhao Ke's shadow in her. Pei Chichi was a little dazed. That woman really didn't care about her at all. She had never seen her come to see her secretly since she was born. No matter how harshly Zhu Mailin treated her, when Pei Huan left the house today, Zhu Mailin was her biological mother. She shed tears sincerely for quite a while. At that moment, she envied Pei Huan. The stylist placed her hand on Pei Chichi's shoulder. Her name was Peaceful, and she was the best stylist in B City. She was very famous, and many singers and actors looked for her to style. They also addressed her respectfully as Sister Ning. Peaceful's hand gently touched Pei Chichi's hair as she looked at her work in the mirror. She smiled and said, "You look good, so no matter what you do, it will look good." Sister Ning's skills are good, Pei Chichi smiled. Her hair was tied up in a simple braid, and she looked like a European girl. Her small face had a thin layer of makeup on, and she was wearing the latest Fan Jessie collection. The pure white organza was decorated with romantic flowers that extended from her chest all the way to her skirt. Especially the item hanging around her neck, Sister Ning could tell that it was something good. Chapter 164. Ning Jie couldn't help but touch it. Her voice trembled. "Did Mr. Tang give this to you?" Pei Chichi nodded. "He brought it back from a business trip." This silly girl. How could she buy something like this now? However, Ning Jie didn't say anything. She just smiled. Mr. Tang must have his reasons for not telling her. "Take a seat." Ning Jie looked at the time. "Mr. Tang will be here soon. I still have something to do." Then, she smiled at Pei Chichi. She felt that it was a pity. With this girl's qualifications, if she entered the entertainment industry, she would definitely become famous. However, Mr. Tang probably wouldn't bear to do it. Pei Chichi nodded. She stood up and watched Jing Jing leave. Then, she turned around and sat down. However, her mouth and nose were covered. Pei Chichi's eyes widened. She looked at the black shadow in the mirror. Gradually, she felt dizzy. She struggled a few times and finally, her head drooped. The people behind her dragged her to the corridor outside. A basin of cold water was poured on Pei Chichi's face. She woke up with a start. Her wrist hurt. She opened her eyes. It was dark and there was a rotten smell in her nose. She looked around and confirmed that she was in an abandoned factory. It was dark and empty. "You're awake." A female voice was heard. Then, Pei Chichi's chin was pinched. She was forced to look up and saw a familiar, yet strange face. This girl had come to see her before. The girl smiled coldly. "Do you still recognize me? My name is Tian Tian," Tian Tian reminded. "If it weren't for you, I would have already climbed into Mr. Tang's bed." That time, she almost became Mr. Tang's woman. It was her first time. If Mr. Tang wanted her, he wouldn't treat her badly. Later, she looked for Pei Chichi, hoping that she could serve Tang Yu together. However, Pei Chichi didn't give her face. Tian Tian's personality wasn't like her name. Women who stayed in brothels were ruthless. They would only be treated badly. Of course, Pei Chichi didn't forget. "What about now?" Tian Tian chuckled. "If I paint your face, do you think Mr. Tang will still like you?" Tian Tian looked at Pei Chichi's clothes and the rich jade necklace with jealousy. Versace's haute couture, this. As soon as the knife touched the chain, it fell into her hand. At the same time, Pei Chichi's neck was cut, and a few drops of blood rolled out like congealed beads. It was especially obvious on the soft skin of her neck. Pei Chichi didn't say anything. At this moment, Tian Tian was like a wild beast in front of him. Whenever she smelled blood, the more afraid you were, the more excited she became. Her forbearance made Tian Tian a little dissatisfied. The cold knife in her hand was pressed against Pei Chichi's face. "Tell me, if I cut your face, what will you do?" Pei Chichi didn't know if she would. Pei Tian, Tian Tian, Tian and Tang. Pei Chichi didn't know if she would, but she was sure that Tian Tian was already a monster. A monster drowned in money and vanity. She just didn't know it. "Why can you get all this, but I don't?" Tian Tian's body bent slightly. She looked at Pei Chichi with a fierce gaze. "Why won't you share all this with me?" Chapter 165. The blade in Tian Tian's hand gently scratched Pei Chichi's face, and a string of blood beads rolled down her fair face like red dew. Pei Chichi felt a tingling pain on her face, but she didn't cry out. "Does it hurt?" Tian Tian's little face stroked the blood beads, and her voice was so gentle that it gave her goosebumps. "Pei Chichi, are you afraid?" Pei Chichi glared at her. "You must think I'm crazy, right?" Tian Tian laughed, then stood up and forcefully pulled down Pei Chichi's chair. With a bang, Pei Chichi's body fell to the ground, along with the chair. Her arm violently rubbed against the rough concrete floor, leaving a long trail of blood. Pei Chichi groaned, but she stubbornly endured it, unwilling to show weakness in front of this lunatic. "Ah, such a beautiful dress is torn. What a pity." Tian Tian pretended to be surprised and kicked Pei Chichi with her high heels. "It's no use pretending to be dead, because," as she said this, Tian Tian slowly stood up. Her voice was very light, so light that it made people's hair stand on end. "Do you know, this is an abandoned warehouse that hasn't been used for about 10 years. If you were tied up here alone, would you starve to death? Just because of Tang Yu?" Pei Chichi suddenly raised her little face. Her hair was messy, scattered on the side of her neck, and her body was covered with blood. She looked frightening. She looked at Tian Tian, her eyes slightly enlarged, and the corners of her lips twitched. "This is against the law." Tian Tian giggled. "Against the law? Pei Chichi, are you really naive, or are you pretending to be naive? In fact, you and I are the same, using our bodies to sleep with men. That's also against the law, who cares?" She just didn't like Pei Chichi, and that was it. Tian Tian raised her hand and took off Pei Chichi's watch. "Look at the time one last time. It's 6 o'clock now. Think about it, how long can a person live without eating or drinking?" Pei Chichi's phone was also turned off and thrown on the ground. Anyway, Pei Chichi couldn't break free from the rope. Originally, she wanted to find 2 men to defile her, but she felt that it was meaningless. Outside the door, a young man whispered, "Sister, hurry up, it's getting dark." Tian Tian smiled and retreated, admiring the way Pei Chichi fell to the ground. When she reached the door, she turned around and left. Pei Chichi stared blankly at the heavy door as it closed. The light became dim again. She lay there, her body full of pain. His head was spinning because he had lost too much blood. Time passed by bit. She lay on the ground and struggled to move her body, but her arms were tied to the back of the chair. Every movement hurt her muscles and bones. Big beads of sweat appeared on her forehead, dripping down one by one. The sweat flowed to her wounds, and the pain was so painful that her face was almost distorted. It was impossible to say that she didn't feel despair. Pei Chichi struggled again and again, lying on the ground again and again. Her little face was covered with blood and dirt, and the original color could no longer be seen. Slowly, she lost all her strength and stopped moving on the ground. Lying there, her whole body seemed to be drained of energy. It was very painful. In her mind, the image of Pei Ming sitting in a wheelchair floated. Pei Chichi cried. Chapter 166. Lin Jinrong and Pei Huan's wedding was held in a hotel owned by Sheng Yuan. It was grand and lively, and almost all the bigwigs in B City were there. Of course, there was only one person missing. Tang Yu. Lin Jinrong's mother and Lin Yun were chatting together. Lin Yun looked at the time and complained, Why isn't Tang Yu here yet? Lin Jinrong's mother smiled faintly. Maybe he's waiting for a female companion. I heard that Tang Yu has a girlfriend. Lin Yun took out her phone elegantly. There's one, it's Pei Huan's sister. She looks pretty good. Lin Jinrong's mother sighed and continued, I saw her from afar. She's really pretty. No wonder Tang Yu likes her. Up until now, there were very few girls that could catch Tang Yu's eye. Lin Yun had already dialed Tang Yu's number. Her voice was gentle. Why isn't Tang Yu here yet? It wasn't Tang Yu who picked up the phone. It was Meng Qingcheng, who had forgotten where Lin Yun was. Pei Chichi has been kidnapped. What? Chichi has been kidnapped? Even though Lin Yun was used to seeing things, she was still shocked. Lin Jinrong's mother was also stunned. How could that be? Does Tang Yu have a way? The girl was so beautiful. It would be great if nothing happened to her. In Lin Jinrong's mother's heart, Pei Chichi was much more pleasing to the eye than her future daughter-in-law, Pei Huan. Hence, she was a little concerned. Lin Yun calmed down. Tang Yu has already thought of a way. Lin Jinrong's mother was about to speak when she saw her son walking quickly towards the door. Pei Huan tried her best to pull him back, but she couldn't. Lin Jinrong shook her off. Jinrong. She was shocked. What are you doing? Lin Jinrong had already walked out of the hall. Pei Huan's eyes were filled with tears and her body was trembling. Even though Zhu Mailin tried to stop him, Pei Huan couldn't take it. On the night of their wedding, he abandoned her to look for Pei Chichi. He went to find Pei Chichi. Pei Huan screamed, Lin Jinrong likes Pei Chichi. For her, he doesn't want me anymore. He doesn't want the child in my stomach anymore. Zhu Mailin was about to die from anger. How could she be so stupid? She stretched out her hand and gave Pei Huan a hard slap to wake her up. Pei Huan turned her face to the side. She looked at Zhu Mailin and said softly, Mom, you hit me. How could you hit me? He betrayed me over and over again. He even slept with Pei Chichi's best friend. Do you know why? He just wanted me to give up. He just told me that if any woman climbed into his bed, he would. This is retribution. It's retribution that I drugged him. Pei Huan's face was covered in tears and she looked rather pitiful. The members of the Lin family also understood and looked at Pei Huan in a new light. Especially Lin Jinrong's mother, she was stunned. She and Lin Yun looked at each other, unable to accept this fact. It was obvious that Jinrong didn't like Pei Huan, but he actually liked Pei Chichi. And Pei Chichi and Tang Yu had that kind of relationship. Lin Jinrong's mother was a little embarrassed. Lin Yun patted her hand and said gently, the most important thing now is to find Jinrong and get married. Tang Yu will find Chichi. Chapter 167. Tang Yu sat in the command center of B City's traffic bureau, accompanied by the chief personally checking the surveillance cameras. There were so many roads in B City, big and small, that it was dizzying to look at. However, Tang Yu sat there with a calm gaze, even though his heart was trembling slightly. Next one, he said in a low voice, lit a cigarette, took a puff, and let it burn on his fingertips. In the ashtray on the table, there were already more than 10 cigarette butts. More than an hour had passed, but they still couldn't find which road the white beetle had taken. Sister Ning was also there, and she felt guilty. If she had stayed with them, Pei Chichi wouldn't have been taken away. Her gaze was also fixed on the screen, afraid that she would miss something. Suddenly, Tang Yu's finger tapped lightly, and the picture froze. That white car was frozen in time. Tang Yu tapped a few more times, and the car was zoomed in, and zoomed in again and again, until the license plate could be seen clearly. Go and find out who the license plate belongs to. Tang Yu's voice was very soft. The chief was stunned, and he immediately went to do it. In less than a minute, he found out. A girl called Tian Tian, in her 20s. This is the phone, and there are photos. The color photos were printed out. Tang Yu only took a glance and frowned deeply, while Meng Qingcheng almost fainted. God must bless Pei Chichi to live a safe and sound life. Not a single strand of her hair could be lost, otherwise, he would probably lose his life. I'll go and contact her right now to negotiate with her, Meng Qingcheng said hurriedly, knowing that he had done something wrong. Tang Yu looked at him. I want to see her in an hour. Meng Qingcheng nodded. Of course, he wouldn't act rashly and alert her, and he wasn't sure if she was with Pei Chichi right now. However, he was very familiar with the boss of fireworks, so he settled it with one phone call. He put down the phone with beads of sweat on his forehead. We can set off now. Tang Yu had already walked out of the room. He had taken off his handmade grey suit and unbuttoned his shirt, which was wrinkled from sitting for a long time. His entire body was filled with a solemn aura. Meng Qingcheng hadn't seen Tang Yu like this for a long time. When he walked to the door, he saw Lin Jinrong. Tang Yu narrowed his eyes and looked at him. Lin Jinrong's fist had already arrived, but Meng Qingcheng blocked it. You still have the mood to fight. You said you would take good care of her. Where is she now? Lin Jinrong's hair was messy and his black evening gown was wrinkled. Tang Yu's gaze was slightly cold. Jinrong, don't forget that today is your wedding. He paused for a moment and got into the car. The driver drove the car because he needed to calm down. Lin Jinrong watched the black limousine disappear into the traffic. He got into his own car and sped up to catch up. Half an hour later, there were fireworks everywhere. The moment Tian Tian entered the private room, she wanted to run. However, her hair was grabbed by Meng Qingcheng. He dragged her in front of him and slammed her hard on the glass coffee table. Why are you running? Tian Tian's head hit the coffee table with a loud bang, and there was a smear of red blood flowing down from her forehead. Where is she? Meng Qingcheng held her down. It was Tang Yu who said that. His eyes narrowed as he looked at the necklace around her neck. That was the one he gave to Pei Chichi. His eyes fell on her wrist. The watch was also Pei Chichi's. It was the same as the one on his hand. Chapter 168. Qingcheng, let her go, Tang Yu suddenly said lightly. Meng Qingcheng was stunned for a moment. Brother, did I hear it wrong? However, as soon as he loosened his grip, Tian Tian stood up. When she met Tang Yu's eyes, her body shrank and she instinctively wanted to cover her body. She didn't expect that Tang Yu could find out about her. Tang Yu was very calm. Take off the necklace and the watch. Tian Tian looked at him carefully and pursed her lips. She was half a second late. I don't have that much patience. He pressed out the cigarette in his hand. It was in her palm. Tian Tian let out a violent gasp. Her voice was hoarse, but she didn't dare to say a word. Enduring the pain, she hurriedly took off the things and put them in front of him. Tang Yu reached out and casually threw the watch into the trash can. He wiped the necklace with his finger and put it in his pocket. Lead the way, he said calmly. Tian Tian was shocked. She could already see the Grim Reaper in front of her. When they went out, Lin Jinrong's car was also parked downstairs. When Tang Yu passed by him, he paused for a moment. If I were you, I would go back to the wedding. Lin Jinrong didn't speak, and Tang Yu let him be. Tian Tian sat in the back seat of the car. Meng Qingcheng was driving in front, and Tang Yu was beside her. Tang Yu hadn't asked how Pei Chichi was. She was afraid and didn't dare to say it. It's in front. She raised her injured finger and pointed to an old warehouse in front of them. Tang Yu sat in the car. The light in the car was dim, and Tian Tian could feel him looking at her. Her body trembled, and then she was dragged out of the car by Meng Qingcheng. He dragged Tian Tian and walked in front. Tang Yu and Lin Jinrong followed behind. Behind them, there were more than a dozen people, all of whom were Sheng Yuan's security guards. The police should have intervened in this matter, but Tang Yu declined. With such an action, Meng Qingcheng knew that Tian Tian would definitely die. The warehouse door was kicked open and the lights came on. Tang Yu stood at the door, looking at the dark warehouse. A rotten smell wafted into his nose. It was also mixed with a hint of blood. He walked in quickly. After about 10 meters, he saw Pei Chichi lying on the ground. Her dress was covered in blood as she lay there motionless. Tian Tian was scared to see her like that. I didn't kill her. I only slashed her face, and she accidentally fell down. She tried her best to twist her body, wanting to break free, but Meng Qingcheng held her down firmly, not letting her move. Tang Yu didn't bother with her. He quickly walked forward, squatted down and patted Pei Chichi's little face. Chichi, when he felt her warmth, his heart fluttered. She was alive. He didn't dare to move her around as he was afraid that she would have other internal injuries. But looking at her face and the blood on her body, he wanted to kill Tian Tian. Of course, there was also self-blame. Pei Chichi moved slightly. It was already 9 o'clock. She had been lying here alone for 3 hours. She thought she was going to die here. Who was here now? Pei Chichi slowly opened her eyes and saw Tang Yu's handsome face. In his eyes, there was a trace of anxiety that wasn't usually seen. Tang Yu. Her voice was so weak that it was almost inaudible, but Tang Yu still heard it. "Can you move?" he said, almost in her ear. Pei Chichi kept looking at him. Her eyes were moist. Chapter 169. Meng Qingcheng asked someone to find a knife and cut the rope around Pei Chichi's hands. Tang Yu touched her carefully, afraid that he would hurt her. When he moved, she groaned in pain. Tang Yu looked at the wound on her neck and the large bruises on her arms. His brows furrowed tightly as he carefully took off his shirt and wrapped it around her injured body. "Let me carry her." Lin Jinrong stepped forward and said hoarsely. Tang Yu glanced at him and suddenly took out the necklace from his shirt pocket. He put it on Pei Chichi in front of Lin Jinrong. Lin Jinrong's expression changed instantly. "I will marry her." Tang Yu's voice was low and powerful. Everyone present heard it. Pei Chichi heard it in a daze, but she had no energy to think about it. She closed her eyes and fell asleep. Even so, her little hand still hugged Tang Yu's neck and her little face rested on his shoulder. Lin Jinrong closed his eyes. When she was at her weakest, Tang Yu was there, and so was she. But her eyes never fell on him. Lin Jinrong clenched his fists. "Pei Chichi, do you know that you have fallen in love with Tang Yu? You just don't know it. But a man like Tang Yu, as long as he is sincere, any woman will fall in love with him." Lin Jinrong just stood there and watched as Tang Yu carried Pei Chichi and walked out. The Lin family also arrived. The wedding was very lively. They came to the warehouse to get married. When they arrived, they saw Tang Yu carrying Pei Chichi. Lin Jinrong stood there and watched. Everyone was a little sad, but when they saw the necklace on Pei Chichi's neck, they all fell silent. They didn't expect Tang Yu to have made up his mind. Lin Yun also came and didn't know what to say. "Mom, I'll take Chichi back first." Tang Yu's voice was a little hoarse. She seemed to be fine, but her external injuries were a bit serious. He had already asked Meng Qingcheng to send a doctor to Xia City. Lin Yun nodded. She couldn't help but sigh in her heart. She didn't care much about her son's matters, but Jinrong actually liked him too. Today's marriage had become like this. If they became a family in the future, how would they see each other? Tang Yu was about to leave with Pei Chichi in his arms. Pei Huan held her stomach and followed them. The Lin family had had enough of her willfulness. Even though Jinrong was not good, if it wasn't for the fact that this girl was too scheming, things would not have turned out this way. Pei Huan looked at Tang Yu carrying Pei Chichi and raised her head high. "Pei Chichi, are you happy now? My life, my only wedding was ruined by you." She raised her hand and was about to slap Pei Chichi. Tang Yu grabbed her with one hand and threw Pei Huan aside, not caring whether she was pregnant or not. If she didn't cherish herself, others wouldn't cherish her either. Fortunately, Lin Jinrong's mother was kind enough to catch her. "If you dare touch her again, I'll make you regret it," Tang Yu said in a low voice and walked out of the dilapidated warehouse. The rest of the people were either in a daze or crying and making a ruckus. The farce slowly came to an end. Tian Tian was tied to the chair, and there was a deep cut on her face. She covered her face and let out a scream, but no one paid attention to her and let the wound on her face bleed. Chapter 170. Tang Yu carried Pei Chichi and walked out. He held her carefully, afraid that he would hurt her. He had never lost his composure in front of so many people before. He didn't wear a single piece of clothing just to make her feel more comfortable. Pei Chichi's little hand hung around his neck. She was half asleep. Perhaps it was the warmth of his body that made her feel at ease, so her little face was pressed against his chest. Her long hair tangled around Tang Yu's body. He opened the door and carefully carried her into the car. Meng Qingcheng immediately followed and got into the car. The car door closed, cutting off everything. Lin Jinrong stood there, motionless. There was no expression on his face. Pei Huan laughed, her face full of tears. Lin Jinrong, see? You've loved her for 2 years, but it's not even 2 months for them. Lin Jinrong was unmoved. He just looked in the direction of the car. Pei Huan murmured, "You still love her, Pei Chichi. I ruined your love and you ruined my marriage. We're even now." Pei Huan raised her head, her face full of tears. On the day she thought she had reached the pinnacle of her life, she lost completely. Lin Jinrong finally looked at her. "Pei Huan, what about me? Who was going to pay for his love?" Tang Yu brought Pei Chichi back to Xia City. She had been in a daze. He was worried and hesitated if he should take her to the hospital for a thorough examination. "Let the doctor come and take a look." Meng Qingcheng stopped the car. "She seems to be fine. She's probably scared out of her wits." Thinking of that place, where Pei Chichi was tied up and thrown there, Tang Yu's eyes surged with a storm. Meng Qingcheng said in a low voice, "That girl will definitely be cleaned up." As for me, Tang Yu ignored him. He directly carried Pei Chichi out of the car. Meng Qingcheng hurried to open the car door. When they returned to the apartment, the doctor was already waiting at the door. It was Dr. Mai. "Hurry up and let me take a look." Dr. Mai and Tang Yu were familiar with each other. She had come to take a look at the young lady's body before. It had only been a few days. How did she end up like this? Tang Yu carried her into the bedroom. Meng Qingcheng did not have the guts to follow them in, so he waited at the door. Tang Yu carefully took off his shirt and put her down. Pei Chichi woke up a little and looked at Tang Yu with misty eyes. There was a rare softness in her eyes. Dr. Mai gently pressed various parts of Pei Chichi's body. From time to time, she would ask Pei Chichi if it hurt. Although he had to endure it, there were no other major problems. "It's just a superficial wound," Dr. Mai said softly. Then, she carefully inspected the wound on Pei Chichi's face. "Fortunately, it's quite shallow. Otherwise, it wouldn't look good if it left a scar." Tang Yu pursed his thin lips, his dark eyes locked onto Pei Chichi's face. "It's a little painful. Bear with it." Dr. Mai's heart ached for the young lady, so she gently whispered in her ear. Pei Chichi made a sound of agreement and obediently let her treat the wound. "Just wash your face and apply some medicine. Wrap your arm," Dr. Mai said to Tang Yu. She paused. "It shouldn't leave a scar." Actually, Tang Yu did not really care about it now. He bought Pei Chichi because of her good looks. However, when she was lying on the ground like that, he felt that he bought Pei Chichi as a person. Everything about her was his, good or bad. She was his. Chapter 171. Tang Yu saw that Pei Chichi's gown had already turned grey. He took a pair of scissors and carefully cut the gown open. When her body appeared inch by inch in front of him, Tang Yu almost lost his composure. His face was slightly red as he hurriedly reached out to cover her with the blanket. Dr. Mai had already packed up her things and told him, "If you don't have a fever, you don't need to take anti-inflammatory medicine. If you do, it's best to take it for 2 days. I'll come back tomorrow to change the dressing." Tang Yu walked her out, and Meng Qingcheng followed him out. Dr. Mai still gave him a few more instructions. Eat a light diet for the next few days. Otherwise, it won't be good if there are scars. She blinked at Tang Yu. "She's such a pretty girl, isn't she?" Tang Yu's face also blushed a little, which was rare. He closed the door and walked back to the bedroom. Pei Chichi was still awake, and she was looking at him with her eyes wide open. "Tang Yu, I ruined their wedding," she said softly. The moment she opened her mouth, the wound on her face twitched, and her little nose wrinkled. She was still afraid even now. Tang Yu sat by the bed and reached out to touch her little head. "It's not your fault." Pei Chichi did not say anything. She just closed her eyes, looking extremely fragile. He felt a wave of heartache. "Don't think about it. It's all in the past." It was rare for him to coax a little girl, but he didn't know how to do it. Pei Chichi's eyes were filled with tears as she stared at him. Tang Yu surrendered. His voice was low and deep with a hint of helplessness. It's my fault. He was the one who provoked that girl. If it wasn't for him, she wouldn't have suffered like this today. He was very close to her, so Pei Chichi easily raised her hand and slapped Tang Yu's face. Her slap was very light, and her little hand was soft, but it was a solid slap on Tang Yu's face. Tang Yu glared at her. After hitting him, Pei Chichi regretted it at first, but he still dared to glare at her. She bit her lips and glared back at him. She used her uninjured hand to pull the blanket up to her chin, covering half of her face. She looked a little childish. Tang Yu felt that he shouldn't hold a grudge against a child. Moreover, this matter was indeed his fault. He reached out and flicked her little forehead. Do you want to have something to eat? Tang of you? Other than porridge, what else can you do? His little friend became bold and talked back to him again. But this made Tang Yu very happy. He smiled and suddenly lowered his head to press his lips against hers. His voice was unbelievably hoarse as he said, "Make love." Pei Chichi blushed and turned her body, trying to escape. She didn't know what to do. Her nostrils were filled with his scent. Rest for a while. I'm going to make porridge. He reached out and stroked her. Little dirty cat. Pei Chichi suddenly thought of the first time they met. That day, she had bitten him. Now he was calling her a dirty cat. He was the dirty one. If it wasn't for him, being involved with someone else, she wouldn't be in such a miserable state. When her little teeth bit him, Tang Yu lowered his head and looked at her like a little kitten. Of course he could lift her up, but she would be in a lot of pain. So he could only bear with it and let her bite him. Pei Chichi snuggled in his arms. As she bit him, she loosened her mouth. She retreated a little and looked at him. It was a little unsightly. Suddenly, she felt a surge of warmth. Tang Yu was really indulging her. Chapter 172. She was in a daze. Tang Yu was moved for a moment. He lowered his head and asked with an indescribably hoarse voice, "Do you want to do it?" No. Pei Chichi was in a daze. Then, she suddenly reached out and hugged him. It was painful to stretch her arms like that, but she just wanted to hug him. She was like a child, hugging him stubbornly. That look completely shattered Tang Yu's heart. He had never seen such an awkward young lady. Tang Yu lowered his head to look at her. He did not say a word, but his heart was burning. Even he himself could not describe the feeling. He rarely had such strong feelings. Even for his own mother and Tang Xin, he had never felt so close. It was as if she had been born from his flesh and blood. He suddenly remembered that she had called him daddy. He could not help but smile as he thought about it. He kissed her forehead very gently. "Let's do this." He held her little hand and coaxed her gently. "All right, put it down. It won't be good if you bleed again." It was rare for her to be disobedient. She still hugged him stubbornly. Tang Yu had no choice. "Then I'll carry you to the kitchen." She nodded. He did not know what to say about her clinginess, but he liked it. He patted her little butt. "Let me put on my clothes." Pei Chichi's little face was a little red. She stepped aside to let him put on his clothes. Tang Yu buttoned up his shirt and looked at her. Then, he slowly opened his arms. His gaze was calm, and there was not much expression on his handsome face. However, Pei Chichi still saw a touch of gentleness in his eyes, a touch of gentleness that was rarely seen. And it was dangerous. If she went there now, she might not be able to turn back. If it were any other day, Pei Chichi would definitely not jump into his arms. However, it was different today. Slowly, she rested her little head on his shoulder and wrapped her legs around his waist. Tang Yu carried her with one hand and stood up, hugging her firmly. This posture was like hugging a little daughter. His heart was burning. He was already thinking about how he would hold his and Pei Chichi's daughter in the future. Even if it was just porridge, he was still not very skilled, and he still had to carry his little friend. "Chichi, can you come down? It's not easy to do things like this," he coaxed. Pei Chichi refused to get down. Her fair and tender hands wrapped around his neck. From where he was, he could see her injuries. He sighed in his heart. He would let her do whatever she wanted. It took an hour to cook the porridge. For a man like Tang Yu who graduated from an Ivy League school, It was an insult to his intelligence. His little friend looked at his clumsy movements and actually leaned on his shoulder and laughed softly. Tang Yu patted her butt. "How dare you laugh?" She stared at him with her dark eyes, so innocent and small and wicked. Tonight, she was really clingy to him. Tang Yu carried her onto the counter cleanly. The cold surface made her a little uncomfortable. She was also afraid that he would mess around, so she wrapped her arms around his neck and hugged him tightly, not letting him kiss her. He patted her again angrily. Pei Chichi moaned. On one hand, it was because of the pain. On the other hand, it was because he would like it. Unknowingly, she would actually try to please him and please him. Tang Yu buried his face in her little neck. His voice was unbelievably hoarse. "Chichi." Chapter 173. Slowly, she turned her little face to look at him. Her eyes were unbelievably beautiful under the light, as if there were countless little stars in them, dazzling. Tang Yu suddenly reached out to cover her eyes, leaned forward, and kissed her. Because he was too excited and restrained. His strong back was twisted, and his whole body was aching. However, he was extremely careful, afraid that he would hurt her. He only dared to kiss her for a while before letting go of her little mouth, his fingers caressing her unwillingly. His expression was a little meaningful as he whispered into her ear, "Chichi, do you want it?" Her eyes widened, and after a while, she said softly, "I'm hurt." He was the one who wanted it. Tang Yu bit her thin earlobe. "You're on top." After he bit her, he looked at her with a clear gaze. Pei Chichi thought of the word beast. "Tang Yu, I think you're feeling guilty tonight," she said slowly, finally regaining some of her rationality. Tang Yu stared at her, not believing his ears. Where did the clingy little friend go? He coughed lightly. "I didn't want her." However, his words were weak. His little friend obviously didn't want to hear it. "Then you must have kissed her." Pei Chichi sat there and stared at him, her eyes filled with a rare tenderness. Tang Yu had never liked dolls, but from this moment on, he liked them. He was born cold, and he thought that he wasn't too interested in all kinds of beautiful women. However, he now knew that it wasn't that he didn't care, but that those women weren't beautiful enough. If they were as breathtakingly beautiful as Pei Chichi, he would have fallen for them a long time ago. Tang Yu was helpless. He couldn't deny it. Chichi. Was she done for tonight's sex life? She was hurt today, but she was so clingy and adorable. He wanted to dote on her. Pei Chichi bit her lip. "Tang Yu, I'm hungry." She looked pitiful. Yu Hua Daotian had already extinguished the fire. He poured a small bowl for her and watched as she ate. That night, he held her in his arms, tossing and turning, but to no avail. Pei Chichi was exhausted, but she couldn't fall asleep. Her eyes were wide open, staring at the ceiling. Why didn't she turn off the lights? Tang Yu couldn't care less. Even if she fell asleep, he could do it himself. However, Pei Chichi refused to sleep and kept rubbing against his body. Tang Yu pressed on her calf. Pei Chichi. Did she think that he loved her so much that he was torturing her with all his might? Under his deep gaze, she finally became obedient and obediently fell asleep, nestling in his arms. He closed his eyes to rest. Actually, he didn't dare to sleep because he was afraid that he would squeeze into her wound. Even so, she still wasn't obedient. Her little hand quietly reached out and touched his smooth chin. "Tang Yu, are you feeling terrible?" He calmly pressed her waist and gritted his teeth. "What do you think?" Pei Chichi buried her face in his arms and smiled mischievously. Tang Yu didn't know what to do with her. He hugged her for a while longer, and the fire in his heart was coming out. Finally, he exhaled. "I'm going to the washroom." However, a small hand held his waist. Then, she climbed into his arms. Tang Yu's voice was trembling. "Chichi." Chapter 174. Tang Yu exhaled deeply. As he sat up, he held onto her frail body. She sat in his arms and lowered her eyes. "Tang Yu, be gentle." That night, he was very gentle, so gentle that Pei Chichi wanted to cry. The next day, when Dr. Mai examined her, she found that Pei Chichi's injuries had worsened, and there were some unexplainable bruises on her body. As a doctor, how could she not understand this? Pei Chichi felt very uncomfortable. She turned her little face away, not daring to look at Dr. Mai's face. When she turned away, she happened to meet Tang Yu's gaze. He was sitting on the sofa in front of the window, reading a magazine. Although he said he was reading a magazine, he was actually looking at her. When their eyes met, Tang Yu smiled lightly. Pei Chichi bit her lip and glared at him before looking away again. That gaze and that shy look, if it wasn't the first awakening of love, what else could it be? Tang Yu smiled again. There was something between them. Their relationship seemed to be different. Zhao Ku was playing mahjong with a group of wives. As they played, they listened to the gossip. Did you hear? It was very lively on the day of the Lin family's youngest son's wedding. A rich madam chuckled and played a tile before continuing. Zhao Ku, you'll be happy for a few days if you hear about this. Zhao Ku was a little distracted. What's wrong? What else could it be? The wedding was a mess. The bride's sister was kidnapped and the groom rushed to save her. Tell me, how could the bride hide her face? Zhao Ku was stunned. Pei Chichi was kidnapped? Her expression became serious as she asked, what happened after that? The rich madam smiled knowingly. I knew you'd be interested. You hate Lin Yun so much that her family is in trouble now. Zhao Ku was actually not interested in listening to her nonsense. She stared at her and coughed lightly. I mean, that girl. Is she dead? The rich lady looked at her and screamed, Zhao Ku, I didn't expect you to be so ruthless. How can you die so easily? She read as if she was telling a story. It's really like what's shown in the movie. Then, your stepson, Tang Yu, rescued her. He was rescued? Zhao Ku's face was somewhat disappointed. She muttered these words to herself. How good would it have been if he hadn't been rescued? Here comes the most important thing. Madame Fu lowered her voice. I heard that Tang Yu put the old thing on that girl. He's determined to marry her in the future. Tell me, if this cousin likes a girl, how is he going to get along with her in the future? Especially when that girl and the daughter-in-law of the Lin family are sisters. As he spoke, everyone at the table laughed. It was indeed messy. Zhao Ku pulled out the chair and stood up. The other three looked at her. Why did you stop? I'm not in the mood. Zhao Ku pursed her lips and looked unhappy. She took her bag and went out. When the door closed, Madame Fu had already taken out her phone. Let's call someone else. Zhao Ku's temper has been weird for a long time. In fact, she's just a mistress. She can't show off in public. She's so shameless. They looked at each other and laughed. When Zhao Ku walked out, her body was trembling slightly. Yesterday had been such a good opportunity. If Pei Chichi had died, she would no longer have to worry about Tang Jiyuan finding out about Tang Xin's parentage one day. Chapter 175. Zhao Ku was jealous of Pei Chichi. In her entire life, there had never been a man who treated her like Tang Yu. That man didn't even look her in the eye. Among her many men, just like Pei Ming, most of them only saw her beauty. When had they ever been moved by her at all? Including Tang Jiyuan, she had Tang Xin, and she had used all sorts of methods to make him agree to marry her. Everything she had today, she had fought hard for it. It had nothing to do with Tang Jiyuan, but Pei Chichi easily won Tang Yu's love. He actually wanted to marry her. How was that possible? How was that possible? Zhao Ku held her head high as tears rolled down her cheeks. All these years, she had almost never cried, because crying was the most useless thing. As a man, he didn't look at your tears, but at your body. But at this moment, she felt sad and pitiful. Pei Chichi had gotten what she had schemed for her entire life so easily. How ironic. Pei Chichi was here to collect her debt. She wanted to take away everything she had in the Tang family. Pei Chichi missed a lot of classes. She refused to rest at home and insisted on going to school. Tang Yu couldn't convince her, especially regarding the incident with Tian Tian. He was in the wrong, so he had been giving in to her these days. Sure, I'll drive you there. After class in the afternoon, the driver will pick you up at the company. I'll bring you back after work. Early in the morning, he wrapped his arms around her waist and closed his eyes, making his final concession. Pei Chichi bit her lip and wrapped her arms around his neck. Tang Yu, if you don't want to, then come straight to the company with me. He didn't allow any room for negotiation. Pei Chichi nodded and carefully put on her clothes. Tang Yu walked out. Auntie Lee was making breakfast. When she saw Tang Yu come out, she smiled and served the breakfast. Mr. Tang, breakfast is ready. Tang Yu nodded and looked inside. It's not convenient for Chichi to move her hands. Let's see if she needs help. Although he had been intimate with Chichi for the past 2 days, Tang Yu could be considered an old-fashioned man. He would not be too rash in front of others. Auntie Lee took off her apron. All right, I'll go take a look. When she entered, Pei Chichi was struggling to button a button. Her little face was wrinkled and she looked very pitiful. Auntie Lee hadn't heard about Tian Tian. She was a little surprised by the injury on Pei Chichi's face, but Mr. Tang had been at home and didn't go to work, so she didn't have time to ask. At this moment, Auntie Lee came forward and helped Pei Chichi button up. She asked softly, "What happened?" She was still a little hesitant. "Mr. Tang, did he hit you again?" If that was the case, no matter how handsome or rich he was, he couldn't follow her. What would happen if this continued? Last time, it was violence in that aspect. This time, he was covered in wounds from head to toe. If this continued, it was possible that he would be beaten to death. Pei Chichi put on her shoes and pursed her lips. Her voice was a little soft. "No, I met a bad guy." As for the incident with Tian Tian, she wouldn't say anything. Because if she did, the way Auntie Lee looked at Tang Yu was probably not right again. Before Auntie Lee could say anything, Pei Chichi smiled faintly. "It was Mr. Tang who saved me." "I see." Auntie Lee smiled. "Then you have to thank Mr. Tang." Her words were a little meaningful. Pei Chichi also understood, and her face was a little hot. At this time, Tang Yu came in and said very lightly, "Oh, Chichi, thank you for the past 2 days. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.